finalization of the draft public-private partnership guidelines. This is organized by the USAID Short-Term Assistance to Improve Public Financial Management Reforms Project, the STARE project, in collaboration with the Department of Public Finance of Ministry of Finance. To conduct the keynote speech, may I cordially invite Mr. P. Algama, the Director General of Department of Public Finance of Ministry of Finance and Mass Media.
Good morning and welcome you all for the training program organized jointly by the Department of Public Finance and USAID STARE project on finalizing PPP guidelines. We have already prepared to a number of workshops. You all aware that after 26th 2016 September National Conference on PPP, USAID STARE project organized few workshops, initially to educate participants on public-private partnership and later invite their comments and suggestions for the revised new PPP guidelines. These draft guidelines were referred to many other stakeholders, and we are in the process of finalizing the PPP guideline. Interested parties who have made valuable comments, suggestions to improve these PPP guidelines, and this guideline will be replaced the 1998 Part 2 Private Sector Infrastructure Projects issued in 1998. I am not going to talk longer. It's a great pleasure to be here today to witness the continuing interest of many of you, especially in governance reform as well as on public-private partnership guidelines and the basic other needs for projects management. I wish this training program is a great success. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Algama, the Director General of Department of Public Finance. I would like to invite Mr. David Baxter, the international PPP expert, to address the gathering.
It's a great pleasure to be here. We have been working for quite a while, the majority of this year, in preparing this document that you have in front of you, which are the guidelines. And also, it's good to have guidelines, but if you don't have the institutional capacity to implement those guidelines, it's a challenge. So the STARE project has also held a whole series of workshops to introduce many different public servants from the different ministries to the fundamentals of PPPs, how to procure PPPs, risk analysis, the challenges, etc. What you're going through in Sri Lanka, exploring public-private partnerships, is not a unique experience. There are many countries that are doing this at the same time. Some of the biggest challenges around PPPs is really understanding what a PPP is and the different types. For those who don't know much about it, a PPP is very simply, in the simplest terms, a partnership between the public sector, the government, and the private sector, private parties in the commercial or business world that are interested in something. They enter into a partnership. It's not a handshake, it's a contractual agreement to deliver a service or to build infrastructure over a period of time, and then there's also a period of performance. Some of the faces that I know here in the room will know this, but this is a question I also always ask. How long can PPPs be? What is the duration, the period of performance of PPPs? And I don't know if you're aware of it, but PPPs generally for large infrastructure projects can be 20 to 25 years in duration, and even longer. So you can imagine why you want to make sure that when you go through the whole procurement process, when you investigate the opportunities of PPPs, that you want to ensure beyond a doubt that the PPP path is the one you want to follow, that it's going to make financial sense, that it's financially viable, because who knows what can happen over 20 to 25 years, and whether it is the right choice. And that is something that people forget. People get so excited about PPPs that they just automatically say, we are going to do a PPP. But if you do the correct due diligence, you follow the correct steps of understanding the feasibility in that, you might actually reach a decision that you don't think a PPP is the best idea for that project. Another thing that I've heard in many countries is people say that PPPs are free money. Okay. If anyone ever tells you that a PPP is free money, chase them out the room because they don't know what they're talking about. Okay. The other term, the thing that people say about PPPs, and this is on the political side where it's very sensitive, as soon as you say to people you're going to do a PPP, they get an idea and they hear the word. One thing that goes through their minds, and I'm all sure you've heard it, privatization. A lot of people think PPPs are privatization. And I'll tell you a very simple way to tell you how that is wrong. And if anyone says that to you, you can tell them very simply it's not privatization. A true PPP is a partnership between the public and the private sector. If you're privatizing, what are you doing? You're taking the public sector out. It's only then a private enterprise. Okay. So when people tell you, we don't like PPPs, they're bad, people are going to lose their jobs, you know, the government's going to lose its assets and that, not if it's done as a true PPP. The other final thing about PPPs which I want to mention, which people forget, is that the asset which is typically built under a PPP reverts back to the government after the period of performance. Okay. It doesn't stay the property of the private sector. Okay, so after 20 years, after 30 years, or whatever it is, the intention of that is to hand the project back to the government. And you will see also in the guidelines, if you read it, there are things that talk about closeout clauses and that. And those are typically, and the best way to hand out a project back is that when the private sector, after that 20 years or 30 years, hands it back to you, most PPPs will have certain language that says that the facility, the infrastructure that's handed back to the government has to be in a working condition, and it has to be in the same condition that it was when it was started. So what are we saying there? That's the whole element of proper operations and maintenance planning as well. So in a typical PPP of, say, 25 years, the first 5 years would be like the design and the build of the project and the initiation of the project. The next 20 years is the operation and maintenance. And that's where a lot of governments also get kind of troubled and stuck, because they want to hand it over to the private sector, and then they'll say, we'll talk to you in 20 years' time, and we'll get the project back for you. Well, you can't talk to them in 20 years' time. You have to talk to them constantly. You need to, when you launch a PPP, have somebody in your ministry, your agency to work on that, okay, to monitor and follow the project.
I thank everyone that's here today and all of those who couldn't attend. I would especially like to thank our sponsor, USAID and the American Embassy, for funding this. We've been here for 2 years working in different areas of PFM, the STAIR program. I think you've all been to some of our trainings, and we're going to continue that as we go along. I'd like to also appreciate to Mr. Ogama and his strong leadership in a number of activities in the PFM area. But this wouldn't have happened if it hadn't have been for your support. Now, perhaps you don't feel as if you've had a contribution to it because you haven't been to a few of our trainings, our awareness building. But there's people here that have been very, very instrumental in giving us, the necessary platform to move forward. Right now, we're doing a very good job, but there's a lot of holes out there. These guidelines have been vetted by the major donors, including the World Bank, all right? JICA, ADB, others have had contributions, but the World Bank has been a good partner here. Thank you.
So we've had the welcoming opening remarks. We're going to just talk a little bit of how we got to and where we are. Then we'll talk about the introduction to the draft guidelines, the outline, written comments. There were some stakeholders that gave us specific comments that we will reference just very briefly. Then a review of the guidelines. We would like, during the session at any time, if you have a question, to please feel free to ask. It's important. This is why we had people here. We don't want it to be a one-way thing. We want people to give us feedback. You have the comment sheets, and then at the end of the session, which will be after lunch, we will then also just have some closing comments and what follows. So let's get into some of the details. So this is, as was mentioned, this is the fourth draft. And we could put in there also the final draft, because after this, we are just going to make final edits to the document and then forward it and hand it over to Mr. Algama, who will then do what he has to do in the finance ministry to move it forward. This was developed collaboratively, as was said, between USAID and very, very, very different resources of USAID, and then stakeholders from Sri Lanka as well, over a period of 8 months. And the stakeholders, you would have seen that in the document, or you'll see it when we go through it, that there were considerable stakeholders. So this, please, it's important to take note, was not developed in a vacuum. This was developed collaboratively, and this reflects, we hope, the will of everyone who's going to be working with the guidelines in the future. It reflects the will of the different ministries and organizations we reached out to. The World Bank is important. It also gave its blessing to this document. And this is particularly important because one of the things that I've been reading in the newspapers constantly over the last few months that I've been coming here is the idea that you want FDI, you want to attract foreign direct investment. And to attract foreign direct investment, you have to have a series of best practices, which we have, the guidelines are a series of best practices. And more importantly, best practices that the big World Bank institutions, Asian development banks, etc., will feel comfortable with, because you want a common language that everyone understands when you're talking about it, that it makes sense. And the important piece also there was to harmonize these guidelines with your existing laws and practices. So you have specific procurement guidelines in the country. This should not be seen as in any conflict with it. And other valid laws and practices, this has been harmonized to reflect them as well. So this is here that we've made every effort to reference existing PPP and related legislation. But what drove this document was that a lot of the previous PPP legislation is about 20 years plus old. It refers to types of PPP models that are not used anymore. The language needed to be changed. The circumstances have changed. There's new laws in place that have been introduced. And those documents, if you read them, didn't really give you a continuous picture. They were in pieces. So you had to read a bit here, you had to read a bit here. This document, one of the main purposes of it, is an attempt to streamline the process and the understanding of, if your ministry decided to launch a PPP, what are the basic steps, and what are the basic practices, and what are the things that we have to do to move forward. One thing I also just want to stress is that this gives you guidelines, but you will over time have to develop your own ministerial best practices as well, specific to your mission. There is no standard template that you can just cut and paste or copy whenever you implement a PPP. That is really important, that when you look at a PPP project, every PPP project that you look at, you need to look at as a unique project. But these guidelines will help you move through the process that you generally have to follow. So here's some of the institutions we reached out to, the line ministries. We've had previous events where they were invited. The fact that you are all here today is also part of that continuation of the process of reaching out to the line ministries. Then the new National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships that's being set up at this moment. They will be, their purpose, as Mr. Algama said earlier on, is to act as advisors. So when you have challenges, and I say when you have challenges with implementing PPPs, because you will, everyone, no matter if it's a country that has great experience or not, has challenges, you should be seeing the NAPPP as a resource to go to help you find advisors if you need them, on technical aspects, etc. And you will see that this has also been woven into the guidelines, the role for the NAPPP. The Ministry of Finance, obviously, is the NAPP falls within the Ministry of Finance, but the Ministry of Finance will have sort of an overall oversight over PPPs in Sri Lanka. And it's obvious why, okay? Because as soon as you're using finances which belong to the government, who are the people that are in charge of it? It's the Ministry of Finance, okay? And you will be reaching out to them and collaborating with them, hopefully in the future as well. There was a project committee also. There's a cabinet-appointed negotiating committees that will be set up that are discussed, okay? The Attorney General's office was advised. The importance of the National Procurement Commission can't be underestimated as well. And people might ask, why is the NPC involved? In simple terms, a PPP is a procurement process. It's not a unique, I mean, it is a unique process, but you are still procuring infrastructure services under a PPP. And that's why it's important that everything that we did was also aligned very clearly with the National Procurement Commission. And then the CCEM also will play an important role, as you'll see in the guidelines. Okay, so what it is, basically, it's a clear sequence of steps, and we'll look at that. It replaces the older guidelines, or that's the 1998, and that should have been, if you saw guidelines that hadn't been updated since 1998, that should have been a bit of concern, because PPPs have changed dramatically internationally since 1998. The old guidelines refer to a very, very few types of PPP models that could be introduced. The models, the ways of implementing PPPs have become very, very extensive these days. So I think in the old legislation it talked about BOOs and BOTs. Okay, build, own, operate, build, own, transfer. If you haven't heard of this terminology, we have a nice little presentation we could give to you that gives you a description of, there's maybe 20, 30 different types of models now that are used for PPPs. The most common one, and it's an easy one to remember, is what they refer to as DBFOM. Design, build, which is the typical type of infrastructure projects that countries do. The finance, which brings in the financial side through the partnership with the private sector. And then the OM, the operation and maintenance, those next 20, 25 years after the project is up and running. So what we've done is also to provide a clear logical sequence of the phases of the PPP project management cycle. So there's 5 phases that you will see in this document. And it talks about the feasibility, the pre-ideas, all the way through to when the contract is signed and the management of the project. So here are the guidelines that are clearly defined and described, okay? So we will be looking at in great detail the project identification and selection, okay? And this is, I think, where many of the ministries are standing now. They have been told that PPPs are something that are worthwhile considering. I have read about all 4 newspapers every morning since Saturday when I arrived, and the new budget is full of references to PPPs. And the ministries are very focused on implementing PPPs. But this is one of the most important elements, is when your minister comes to you and says to you, we want to do PPPs, you need to understand the process of how you're going to identify the projects and how you are going to select them. Okay, and remember what I said, that sometimes you might say that the PPP is not the best solution, and we might not do it. Okay, feasibility analysis and preparation. The biggest challenge with feasibility analysis that we constantly hear is that feasibility studies are expensive, okay, take a lot of time, and we don't have the resources to do it. Okay, and I'm just going to state a very important thing, that the better your feasibility study and the more time that you've spent doing that, the better it would be that or more likely that your project is going to be a success. Now, if you do work with the World Bank, for example, the Asian Development Bank, or even the new Chinese Infrastructure Development Bank, all the different institutions that are lending money or helping out with PPPs, they are going to require that you do a comprehensive feasibility analysis of all projects. Then there's also the process of procurement, bidding, and the selection of the partner. Now, one thing that I would say is important, because of the unique elements of PPPs, it is important that you start in your ministries or your agencies exploring how you can get your procurement officers up to speed on what a PPP is. Because it's a different, and I'm going to use the word, and I mean that in the nicest sense, a PPP is a different monster to a typical procurement, okay? It's more complex, it has a lot of added elements, specifically the financial side, and to say to somebody on your team, you're going to do a PPP if you haven't got the experience is very disingenuous and unfair to them, because if something goes wrong, they'll be the people to blame. And this is where you can find, or you can reach out to, in the future, to the NAPPP, the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships. They should be able to help you with the procurement process, the steps to follow. If you need specialists, and there will be times that you will need experts and specialists, they can be a resource to help you find them. And the reason I say this is, if your ministry, for example, if it was the Ministry of Transportation, it's likely that you will do a lot of PPPs, because you could do 5, 6, 7 roads, toll roads. You've got the whole road system that you're building here around the island. Okay? That ministry will have the chance to actually develop its expertise because it's doing repeated PPP projects. But other ministries might only do one PPP project in their what you call it, in 5 years or 10 years. And you can't have a team just sitting around waiting for a project. And that's where you would then reach out to the NAPPP, for example. Then we'll also look at, once the award the project is awarded, how do you work off, how do you sign the contracts, and in the management and monitoring of the project. I mentioned this to one of the classes, and it was a very, very interesting, funny cartoon that I saw once. So when people say, we are happy we've launched a PPP, and that's like, you sign the award and you've got your PPP, okay? And everyone's excited and they say, this is great. That's just the beginning, that's not the end, okay? So let me stress that. That's the beginning, not the end. So you most probably will hire international consultants to help you structure the deal and all of that. And everyone pats themselves on the back and says, congratulations, we've signed. But it's the next 20 years which is going to make or break the project. And I saw this cartoon once in one of the financial newspapers, and it was very, very telling. There were just 2 pictures in the cartoon. And the first one, it had like people with champagne bottles with the corks popping off, streamers coming down from the roof, and people were shouting and they had party hats on, and they said, basically at the bottom said, we've signed the deal, okay? The next cartoon was like meant to be the room next to the room where everyone was celebrating, and there were all the people who were going to be working on the projects, and they were like this, okay? They realized, okay, yes, the deal's been signed, the exciting stuff been signed, but now the work starts.
That is
okay.
a common thing in Sri Lanka.
Okay.
They're very fascinated in launching something.
Yes.
After that, they forget.
Okay. So it was said that it's common in Sri Lanka that it's very exciting to launch the thing, and then once the real stuff starts and people forget or lose interest or get scared or whatever. Okay. So these are some of the things that are really, really important for us. Okay. So I did mention, okay, that the difference here is, that the new framework and strategy is an extension of just these terms that were used typically 20 years ago. Okay. So typically, if you go to many countries, PPP laws, like the Philippines still refers to the BOT law. They haven't even upgraded it. It's just so much easier to use the word PPP. Because if you have a law, and this is something that when you start taking these guidelines and you make them the law, don't box yourself into a very specific term, because if you say in your law that it's a BOT law, what's it going to say? You can only do BOTs. If somebody comes along and says we have to do a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, guess what you have to do? You have to have an act of parliament to change the law to enable you to do this. So this is one of the reasons why why it's revised and it says PPPs, not these terms. Okay. Basically also internationally now, when you go to the World Bank, they have a PPP unit. Here you are setting up the National Agency for PPPs. It's not called the NABOT, it's called the NAPPP with a reason. Okay. This is important that these guidelines are serving as a reference for everyone who's going to be involved in identification, development, and implementation of these projects. And these basically are typically going to be large strategic projects under the definition. I'll tell you why we talk generally about PPPs being very effective with large projects. When you set up the project and you plan it and you bring on all the advisors, there's something called transaction advisors and there's transaction costs. If the project is 10 million or if the project is 50 million, generally those transaction costs are still going to be the same. And so really what it is that the project gets too small, it's not worth it to bring all this expense in. So this is why we specifically refer to large strategic projects. And yet you can say that this is more than $50 million, okay, results in the government having liabilities, including, but also, you know, they have to secure the land, for example, provide funding, enact economic regulations, etc., and are the provision for monopolistic services. So this is important to take note that monopolistic services are clearly referenced. So what we mean by monopolistic is something like an airport. You know, you don't build 5 airports in the same place, you only build one, and it monopolizes air activity in a certain region. Or ports, those are elements of that. So this is covered there as well. So what we've said also that streamlines the process, limits the number of reviews. If you had to follow your old documents and your old laws and that, it was almost impossible to understand if you had even started or if you had even ended, okay? Because you had to do this law, you had to look at this one, you had to look at this Labor Act, you had to look at this financial thing, and no one really knew. And I think that's where quite a lot of the projects got into trouble in Sri Lanka, because there were important steps that were missed, not on purpose. People just didn't realize they were missing it. So this is streamlining it. There's a number of reviews and approvals that are there. Why do we have the approvals? Do you understand the term checks and balances? Okay, the checks and balances is just a number of processes to ensure that everyone who should signs off and that the reviews have been done to ensure that you are getting, and this is the important thing, the value for money that I mentioned. And this is something also that the transactions are transparent and sustainable. The private sector, if they are going to get interested in PPPs in Sri Lanka, if they're going to get interested in financing them, there are critical things that they're going to want to look at. That is competitive procurements, okay? Because no company is going to invest the time in a procurement for a large piece of infrastructure if they think there's a bias towards somebody already, okay? So it's competitiveness and transparency, and by what, and you will see when we go through the guidelines what transparency means, that every decision, every interaction, every bit of communication is shared with everyone who is involved in who's interested in the project until the decision is made. Because if you don't do that, there can be accusations that this was rigged, this was in favor of somebody was well connected, the decision wasn't based on merit. And these aren't things that I'm making up, because this is what I've been reading in the newspapers that I've come here. You know, it wasn't transparent, it wasn't fair, it wasn't competitive, etc. And this is important. International financial organizations will only be interested in these projects if they believe that this is the situation. Okay. Does anyone have a sense of how much money it takes typically for a large company to bid on, say, a $50 to $100 million project, for them to put their team together, to prepare the documents? Do you have any clue? Let me tell you, it's not uncommon for it to be over $1 million. Okay. So if a company is going to invest all that effort in chasing a procurement, with the chance that, you know, when I worked for a large engineering company, we always said our cutoff was if we had a 30% chance of winning the contract, then we would pursue it. Okay. If we weren't convinced we had a 30% chance, we weren't interested, because we couldn't spend millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars chasing projects that maybe wouldn't happen, were bad projects, weren't transparent, weren't competitive, etc. And this is why this is all built into this. Okay. So it's important to have these guidelines, and these guidelines will operate in the interim, and this is important, until a law is developed. Hopefully the guidelines will form the basis of the law. That is the intention, because they are sensible, they're international practices, they are best practices. But it is important that the next steps as we move forward in the next 2-3 years is to develop a updated, concise, comprehensive PPP law for Sri Lanka that isn't in little pieces. Because, for example, you have the PPP law for unsolicited proposals, but it's a separate piece. It's not tied into anything, and this is really important.
Problem is like, we don't have a system to select projects which can be implemented to PPP.
Yes.
And therefore, talk about projects to implement to PPP. But if you look at the, the total investment is very, very marginal amount, like not that 50 million threshold.
Yeah.
And as a buzzword, many people talk about PPP projects in, infrastructure development, sometimes in normal, other projects like construction of buildings, sometimes we don't need that PPP
Yes.
arrangement. We don't have, still we are, in the dark, there's no proper guidance for Sri Lanka right now. What is the experience in other countries?
Okay, that's a very interesting comment. There's no specific guidance. Now, I'm going to tell you 2 examples. Okay, so the Netherlands has very, very good guidance, and what the Netherlands has done over the years, because they have a very mature PPP market, they've identified 3 or 4 models that basically cover everything, and so they've written that into their legislation. Okay, and the one that they've generally chosen is design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, because that covers almost every aspect. That's the easiest way to do it. Then there's countries like Turkey. Turkey last year procured 40% of the world's PPPs. Okay, one country, 40% of all their PPPs that were launched in one country. And they did it, strangely enough, without a PPP law in place. And everyone then throws up their hands and says, well, how can you do that if you don't have a law on that? What they did was the ministries created very, very strong ministerial guidelines and practices. So what I would say is, if I can give advice, understanding which models to use, which way to go, that if, for example, once the guidelines go out and it's the end of 2018 or it gets to the end of 2019 and you still haven't got a PPP law, you can use these guidelines to develop very good practices within your individual ministries to move forward. So I think it depends on the will, but you do need guidelines, and I would say if you use these guidelines, they're the standard. The other thing which just came to mind when you mentioned that also, Mr. Algalmo, is that when people think about PPPs, they get very focused on infrastructure PPPs, but there are also service PPPs, for example, like healthcare, or education, or technological services, okay, which follow the same process, but you don't build an asset, you're actually building a maintenance and operations side, okay. But I would say that, it would be pretty obvious in the next few months what's happening. And the Ministry of Megapolis, I think, is a little ahead of everyone in the country. And they have, they've just done a procurement on water taxis in Colombo. If you want to get some, advice on what worked and what didn't work, what was good, what was bad, and I'm not saying the project is bad, but everything has something good and everything has something bad in it, I would talk to them. One thing that is also important is that every mistake that you make sometimes is the best lesson to ensure success in the future. Because some projects go fantastically well, and then you say, we've mastered PPPs. Well, you might not have mastered PPPs, you might just have been lucky with that project, okay? And then if you try and repeat that model or that process on another project, things go wrong. So please, as you move forward, also capture the mistakes and make those lessons learned which help with your best practices. So everyone wants success. The best success for your PPP markets in this country is going to be success. As soon as the international community starts hearing about successful PPPs, people will start investing. The one thing that also is important that the finance ministry can help with, and I think they should be sort of the center of it, is developing a PPP pipeline, a national PPP pipeline. And what do we mean by that? Is if I run a big company and I'm interested in setting up a business in Sri Lanka because I want to build ports, or I want to build airports, or I want to build roads and that, the only way I'm going to do it is if I do a business analysis to determine what projects are being proposed, what is the idea over the next 3 or 4 years, what project's going to be launched. So it would be really important that the different ministries that are represented here, as soon as you identify 4 or 5 or 3 or 2 or 1 even, project that you're proposing for a PPP, that you feed it to the ministry as well as the NAPPP so they can get a list. Because I will tell you, international financial institutions and companies look to see how many PPPs are proposed for that country. If they see nothing, no one will look at Sri Lanka. If they see 10, they will say, that's great, there's something happening here, it's worthwhile tracking. And one of the things that we have in the guidelines is a database, setting up a database. That's the type of thing that you need to publish before you even put it out on procurement. Once you've got the idea that you're going to do it, start putting it out in the market so that people get a sense. And the market will actually come to you at times and even give you good advice on how you can do it better. And that's also built in the guidelines. These are just different acronyms that are used throughout the document. I think you should be used to most of them. And maybe some of these are just like BOT or BOT are the newer ones that some of you might not have been experienced or exposed to. So we're going to break now for tea, okay? And then after tea, we will start the great discussions and things that will move forward. I talked about the 5 different phases, and you can see that there's a phase 1, which essentially is the project identification and selection. Is the phase 1 here that we're going to be looking at is the identification and selection. This is project feasibility. Phase 3 is the procurement. And then 4 is where we're talking about the award, and 5 is the contract management. What I wanted to point out, though, not so much the diagrams, but is the fact that you'll see that there are 2 there. One is a standard procedure, and the other is an unsolicited proposal, which is the next one. And I wanted to make a very clear distinction and make sure that everyone in the room understands what the difference is between a standard PPP and an unsolicited proposal. So let me just reiterate what the 2 ways how PPPs are launched. Under the standard procedure, which is the first set of the document, that is when the ministry decides itself that it wants to launch a PPP. Okay, so you've decided, if you're the housing ministry, that you're going to build 20,000 housing units for people who are living below the breadline, who need housing support. If you're the roads ministry, you decided you're going to build 5 toll roads of 300 kilometers, for example. If you're the Ports Authority, you might decide you're going to launch a new port and you want to do it. The important thing is to take note, and just to make sure you understand it, that the first set that we're looking at is if the ministry, so that's you, is the initiator, and by that we mean the organization that comes up with the idea for the PPP, and there's a process that is followed. Okay, and that's what we're going to be looking at, all the different clauses as we look. So that's the big difference. The unsolicited proposal is when the private sector comes to you with an idea. Okay, and they're going to say to you, we would like to build a new tourist airport. Let's use that for example. Okay, and I was looking in the 2025 guidelines that you have, that one of the focuses is, improving or using PPPs for domestic airports, and that's really focused on tourism, for example. So they will come to you and they say, we want to build, and I'm making this up, so if I'm horribly wrong, you can just correct me at lunch or something. Let's say we want to build a new tourist airport at Kandy to cater for tourists who are flying in from, let's say, the new Rajapaksa airport or the Colombo airport, and they want to get to Kandy very quickly. Okay. That might not have been anything that the ministry was even considering, had even planned, had even thought about. Okay, so you having the situation now that's a private organization is coming to you and saying, we want to form a partnership with the ministry to build something or to provide a service. Now that's a very appealing sounding thing, because it's always nice when the private sector comes to you and says, we want to do something with you. Okay. But there are a number of challenges, and those are financial, legal, etc. Okay. Or even resources. You might first of all decide, okay, this is a good idea. Okay. It's good that they are going to help finance the project because we don't do it, or we don't have the money. Okay. It's also a good idea because we do need this airport. But we're faced with a number of challenges, and the typical challenges that you would be faced with an unsolicited proposal. First of all, it can be a distraction to what you are focusing on, because if you were deciding to do 3 other tourist airports in 3 other places, and somebody comes along and says, here's a 4th one, okay, can you see what that does? It diverts your attention from the ones that you're focusing on. It adds a need for extra resources because now you've still got to do feasibilities and study, etc. So that can become a problem. It becomes a planning problem. The other is, no matter if the private sector comes to you with a proposal of their own, it still has financial obligations and impacts to your ministry, because remember I said that PPPs are not free money. Okay. So you have to also then determine, when are you going to do this within the budget cycle? Okay, because no ministry can just decide it's going to take on obligations. You have your budget that you're going through at this stage, the budget readings, etc. So there's that implication. But the biggest implication is that when governments consider unsolicited proposals from the private sector, it can lead to a number of problems on competitiveness, because people are going to say, well, why did they get a special deal and we didn't? Okay. Transparency, because how was this procurement offered? You know, that is really important. The other thing, it's very difficult if you weren't considering a project, it's very difficult to determine if it was financially feasible, viable, you know, is it bankable, all those type of things. So it becomes problematic, and what happens is that when countries typically get an unsolicited proposal, they will still go through a procurement process where they invite their competitors to get involved in the process. So these are the 2 differences, and you'll see there's a subtle difference. The biggest challenge with unsolicited proposals, if it's in information technology or things like that, is the whole sense of intellectual property. Okay, because when a private sector comes to you with a great idea, okay, they might think it's a great idea, you might think it's a great idea, or they might think it's a great idea and you don't think it's a great idea. Okay, there's different approaches on that. But when they come to you with that type of thing, and they're going to propose an idea, they're going to be very, very concerned that their idea doesn't get shared with competitors. Now you can understand that, because if I've got a great idea, I don't want to suddenly read in the newspaper there's a procurement and my great idea and all the details are put out there. So that becomes complicated, because as soon as you introduce the idea of this sort of intellectual property and you try and protect the intellectual property, what are the competitors going to accuse you of? A lack of transparency. Can you see why? Because they're going to say, well, these people have got an unfair advantage. They've got information that we don't have access to, and that. So all I want to say is that generally there's 2 types of PPPs. This is why there's 2 groupings here: solicited and unsolicited. And the World Bank, for example, is not extremely happy about unsolicited proposals. They have just put out guidelines on unsolicited proposals. On the very, very first paragraph in that document they put out, it states very clearly that unsolicited proposals should be a solicitation of last resort. What they're saying is, you know, it shouldn't be your first choice. This should be. But the reality is that the private sector can come to you with really great ideas, and you might want to consider it. And in the document there, we talk about the procedures, and there's one term that is thrown out a lot that is revolving around unsolicited proposals, is the idea of the term of a Swiss challenge. Have any of you heard of the term Swiss challenge? Okay, we will touch on it, but a Swiss challenge is a process, and it was started in Switzerland, hence the name, of when a company comes to you with an unsolicited proposal, that you go through a process of testing their proposal in the market by inviting other companies to compete against them. So you may ask, why are there two diagrams here? One is for solicited and one is for unsolicited. Most of the guidelines are similar, irrespective. On this one here for the unsolicited, it's generally this is the same, there's just an extra little process in the procurement process. But the same rules apply, competitiveness, compliance with the law, etc. And it's also important, and this is one thing that ministry is going to have to be, I think, very firm about, is if the private sector comes to you with an idea of an unsolicited proposal, you don't have to accept it. Okay. It's got to be in the interest of your ministry or in the interest of the country. So a lot of pressure could be put on you by saying, I've got a good idea, and pressure, pressure, pressure. You should accept it, pressure, pressure, pressure. You don't have to accept it. That's just the thing I don't want to say. So we're going to start looking at the document, and this is a kind of a lengthy process. We've got over 70 different clauses to get through, but I'm going to go through it slowly and piece by piece, so that if there's something that's not clear, ask. If there's something that we said there that makes you uncomfortable, make that statement. Okay, let us know. But again, the thing I stress is if you have any specific comment, please use those sheets of paper that we gave you and refer to the section. So if we'll be starting with section 1. Make sure that if you have a comment in that, you say section 1. Okay, you can, if you tell me verbally, that's great because it'll be good for the room to hear it. But it's also important that even if you tell me verbally, we're recording this, but still write it down. It is really important that it is written down. Okay, so the first part, this is just general information. So section 1 there, it's introduction. It talks about what a PPP is. And we've been through that. It's simply an alternative procurement process, as it says, where a contractual agreement is based on shared objectives, including project financing between the government and the private sector, whereby the private sector is given the, in some cases, exclusive right and agrees to provide a public service or infrastructure. So I touched on that. Okay, that's the general description. So what we're saying there. An agreement between the public and the private sector to provide, and importantly, the statement is made here, a service or to build infrastructure. Okay. And it says also, although the private sector will deliver this service, the public sector retains the legal public obligation to provide the public service infrastructure. So what we're saying here is you are not separated from this. A lot of times, people get very excited and they say, okay, it's a PPP. It's completely the concern of the private sector. Okay, if that's your attitude, you're in a bad situation. Okay, because you are going to be involved from day 1 to year 25 or whatever. I told a group a very interesting story, one of the training groups, that in one of the Central American countries that a company I was working for, they were running a PPP project with a power producer. And the power producer was doing a very good job, and everyone was pleased. And because they were doing a good job, over the years, the government just got less and less involved and let them run with it and let them do the project. And then one day, there was one of the project managers decided to look at the project files, and he looked at it and he nearly had a heart attack because he realized that the PPP project had actually finished 3 years ago, but no one bothered to end the agreement because everyone was just happy. They were providing the electricity, providing it was at a good price, but no one had read the contract for a number of years, obviously. And what happened was that they realized they had to go back to the private sector and say to them, why are you still doing this? You're supposed to have handed the project back to us. Okay. And you can understand why there's either two reasons, and I'm sure they couldn't challenge them, why the private sector didn't hand it back. Either because they didn't know the terms themselves very well and they didn't bother to see when it was closing out, or they had paid off all their debt and had serviced all their debt, and they were just making pure profit for 3 years, and it was very difficult for them to hand over. You know, they didn't want to hand it back and say, well, the government's not telling us hand it back, so let's keep it. Okay. Yes, they didn't look at the agreement. Okay. I bet you when they pulled that agreement, it was just covered in cobwebs and things like that. Okay. So this is the important part here, is just understanding it. They say there, and there's always a specified period of time. Okay. That is really, really important. Okay. So I'm just going to, so here are the typical types of projects that they talk about. Okay. So it should be structure on a build, own, transfer, build, operate, transfer, boot. There's all different types of projects. But it's important that, as I said, that we've left this pretty wide open so that it allows the different types of PPP options that are out there to be considered. It says here, this is to support and promote the development of infrastructure through PPPs. The guidelines, this is just the preamble, to serve as a reference. I've mentioned that to you. And these are the three terms, $50 million, that it results in government liabilities, and also for the provision of monopolistic services, airports. Okay, so whenever you take on a PPP, okay, the government is going to have certain liabilities and conditions that it's responsible for. Okay, so even though the private sector takes on the debt, or they take on the financing, you are still ultimately responsible for the debt if the project failed. Because if that company becomes bankrupt, disappears, or whatever, and this is one thing that a lot of governments around the world forget, that they think, you know, if the project goes wrong, we're not going to have any risk to our economy, etc. And that is not always the case. Okay. So we're going to talk about here under the section 2 very simply. The purpose is to set out the process that should be followed for both the government and the private sector. So take note here, even though this is predominantly a public sector document, okay, it is important that the private sector understands this. Okay. And I would say that when this document is accepted and it becomes the guidelines, that you have piles and piles and piles of these in your offices, so that if the private sector comes to you and they say we're interested in PPPs and that you give this to anyone who visits. Okay. It's also important that in the data room that we'll talk about, that these guidelines are put on it. And why is it important for the private sector to understand? Because the private sector is not going to make a decision to invest in PPPs if it doesn't understand the process. Okay. If there's a process, they're going to feel a lot more comfortable as well, because they know that you're not going to experiment on them while you're trying to do your first PPP. But if those guidelines are there, they will understand the steps and they'll understand these people know what they're doing, this is the process. And in the projects that I've always worked on internationally with PPPs, the first thing that happens when anyone says we are interested in having or pursuing a PPP in a certain country, the first thing they ask is, are there national PPP guidelines? Are there national PPP law, etc.? And then the company's lawyers and legal experts and financial experts and planners and that are going to read this document themselves. You do not want to be in the situation that the private sector understands this document better than you do. Okay, why is that? Because you could make mistakes that will cost you. Okay, I'm not saying that they exploit you, but if they know it better than you, that is going to result in the situation that you could get not such a great deal. I'm going to run this down a bit. These are the fundamental reasons, essentially, why you consider a PPP. Okay, and these points that are made here are essentially the questions you should be asking yourself when you are considering a PPP. Okay, and the more of these that I say that you can try and fit it in, the better one it's going to be. The term there, value for money, I want to define that for people who don't understand that term, who have never heard it before. Usually you will see it in legal documents with a big V, a small f, and a big M. So if you see that acronym VFM, they're referring to value for money. It is not purely a monetary term, okay? It's what you're saying when you talk about value for money. Are we getting value for the money we are going to spend or we are investing in the project, okay? So that could be, and it's very simple, that say the government needs to build 4 schools, okay, because the demographics are saying we need 4 schools, but you can only afford 3, okay. You have an option of just building 3 and then having overcrowding in the schools, substandard education, etc. Or you could form a partnership through PPP with the private sector to build the additional school, okay. So now you have the 4 schools that you need. Okay. It might cost a little bit more because PPPs are not always cheaper than a government-provided service. But you've definitely got value for money there because all the children are going to go to school and all of them are going to get the same level of education. Does that make sense? It's a very simple way of when you talk about value for money, it's not like buying a car and you're deciding, am I going to get all those fancy big wheels and silver things added on it and that's value for money because the salesman throws it in, or am I going to get a car that works very well? Okay. Value for money is one of the most important considerations. The other is timeliness. You know, you always want to make sure that you can do it within a certain time. And this is going to be one of your biggest challenges because if I read the newspapers carefully that I've read in the last few days on the budget and PPPs, when are the ministers expecting you to do your next PPP in like 6 months? Okay, they want PPPs up and running before the next election. Okay, am I correct? If you read, okay, so everyone's saying PPPs are not next year, they're saying now, okay? And one thing that you need to be very, very careful about, you've got to take the time consideration in for planning, preparing, doing the feasibilities and studies and that, because I don't know the politicians, I'm apolitical, but you don't want to be forced into having a PPP so that a certain minister, the day before he leaves office, can go and cut the ribbon and say to everyone, great, look what I did. I built you another school or whatever, okay? But then 2 years later, when the school falls apart and everything, okay, because it wasn't really a good project, what's that minister going to say? I wasn't in office. It wasn't my baby, okay? The new minister messed it up or something like that, okay? So these are some of the considerations that you've really got. There's no such thing as a quick PPP. Yes.
Can I just ask, in terms of what you were just talking about, how do you ensure sustainability of PPPs if there's a change of government and the guidelines themselves? How do you, because they're not, right now they won't be, in law. So how do you ensure that sustainability?
That's a very valid question because she's smiling. She remembers when the training we talked about political influence, involvement, and all of that, okay? The only way that you can do it, I suppose, and I'm very naive when this, and I'm always optimistic, is that you've got to have best practices that generally are best practices, that are internationally acceptable and things like that, that it doesn't matter what the political change is, that they are still valid. So transparency is a good idea. I don't think, from I read in the newspaper now, I don't think any minister is going to say transparency is a bad idea, no matter what party they come from now, okay? Competitiveness is really important because with the terrible debt that Sri Lanka has, you can't keep on building projects that cost way too much money and don't make any sense, okay? But you do have to have all the stakeholders, the different political parties in that, signing off, and that is the intention of this document, that when it gets accepted, there's going to be a lot of signatures on it, if I understand. And hopefully people remember that they signed that and will stick with that. But there's no guarantees. Okay. So also here, we also wanted the standard specifications, rules, and regulations of good governance. And there are a lot of them. One that's really important, if you haven't read it, is the NPC's, National Procurement Council, NPC's guidelines on the procurements, section 19B of the Sri Lankan Constitution. If you haven't read that, those are just good general practices, fair competition, open bidding, etc. like that. Those are important elements. This here, fair, equal, and maximum opportunity for interested proponents to participate, so everyone. It's important that if you have a good PPP guideline or PPP law, that will attract foreign direct investment. The term that you haven't heard, but it really refers to that, is called the Legal Enabling Environment, or the PPP Enabling Environment. And simply the enabling environment are the rules, guidelines, practices, laws that define how these practices should be implemented. And people will be looking at that. Compliance with laws and regulations, there is nothing worse than, and you'll see this process as we go through it, that you get highly, highly advanced in your planning and your procurement of a PPP for somebody on the last day or 6 months in it to say, you didn't follow the laws and you didn't follow the regulations, so it's done. Okay, that is, and that happens in many countries. You don't have to be worried about this. It happens in the United States where the laws aren't followed and the practices, and then somebody objects and there's a court case and it gets thrown out and the whole process has to stop. Then these terms, transparency, you understand that. Consistency, this is possibly one of the most important elements. This is why you're doing the guidelines that will then become distributed to all the ministries so that you are all doing it the same way. Okay. You don't want to have rules for the Ministry of Transportation and rules for the Ministry of Health and rules for whatever. Any company wants to make sure that the rules are the same and standard for everyone. It says here, this is important, just under section 4, it's just a clarification. These guidelines repeal, replace, and otherwise supersede all previous guidelines issued by the General Treasury and the Minister of Finance, etc. So this will be the guideline documents. Okay, 3 very important clauses, not just for Sri Lanka, for any country in the world. Okay, ethics. So basically, they will be, shall adhere to the Procurement Code of Ethics 2017, issued by the National Procurement Commission. And you might ask, why are we adhering to the National Procurement Commission's ethics? It's very simple. A PPP, whatever you want to call it, disguise it, decorate it, whatever, it's still a procurement. And they are national procurement ethics that involve. Confidentiality, this is important, that it's really important that once you start the process, that information that should stay confidential remains confidential. Just remembering one thing, that there's also information that should be made public. Okay? And some countries, and it's stated here also that right at the end, that once an award or a contract is awarded, all the information about that contract is made public. Okay? So that everyone should see it. So you've got to be very careful on what you define as confidential, if it's really technically and legally correct to define it as confidential or not. Okay. Corruption, this is just language that's really important. I don't think anyone's going to put out rules that say corruption is something we want. Okay. So the comment was that sometimes there are decisions that are made, okay, and should you make that available for people to know? And in this direction, they say yes. Okay, you have got to document very clearly the whole process of how the procurement was, what decisions were made, why they were made. And I tell you why, is because you don't want to be ready on that night that you're going to sign the award and have the big champagne party, and somebody walks in, and this happens in other countries, I don't know if it could happen here, and handovers an injunction from a court and says the project is stopping because we do not believe that all the procedures were followed. Okay. Whether it's right or wrong, that can happen. That will scare away your investors so quickly. Okay. And the challenge of that happening is when that happens, your project gets delayed. If it's a major project, millions of dollars can be lost. Okay, the project could go bankrupt. But if you have kept every record and decision, that is your proof that you would go to the court and say to the judge, read our documentation. And you can see that we believe, without doubt, we shared everyone, we shared the information, we had the discussions, and that wasn't broken. Okay? But it's difficult, and that's why you have lawyers. Okay? Lawyers are the ones you'll go to. Who's the lawyer in the room here? Okay, you've got a few lawyers here. Okay? When in doubt, go to the lawyer, and if that lawyer doesn't give you the right answer, what do? You maybe find another lawyer. Okay? But talk to your legal representatives within your ministry when those questions arrive. What is important, and it states that in the document later on, that when you put out the RFP, the request for proposals, okay, you need to make it very clear what the rules are about confidentiality. The private sector needs to know that if they give a certain amount of information, that it could be made public. Okay. There are things like intellectual property that can be protected, or if it's a bidding price, you know, yes, you would say one company bid 10 million, one bid 11 million, one bid 12 million. But you wouldn't share the information on how they came up and their model that they used, because that's kind of the proprietary information. But it's really important, and I'm glad you mentioned it, that whole idea of confidentiality, it's absolutely critical to the comfort that the private sector is going to have with your PPP, and you need to put that language very clearly in your document. Conflict of interest, that is really important. This is a big challenge in many countries where ex-government employees go and work for the private sector. Okay, so they might have insights, which was information that shouldn't have been shared with the private sector. Okay, or sometimes in many places, in many countries, a government official is also allowed to have a certain amount of private business on the side. So you have to be very clear that you make sure that there's no conflict of interest, whatever. So, and what is important, as soon as this is identified, you should declare it to the NPC. Okay. Now, there can be situations that a person can declare a conflict of interest before, and because they very clearly stated what it is, that the decision could be made that that person can still be part of the process because the conflict of interest has been defined or explained. Okay, but you need to have a document that very, very clearly states the conflict of interest. Okay, this one is very, very difficult. No gifts. Okay. Or inducements. What they mean by that is like little favors or things like that, okay? And if you are a procurement officer or you working with this, you need to be extremely, extremely careful that you don't go and, for example, allow somebody to buy you dinner at an expensive restaurant. Because you might say, that person is my friend. I've known that person for 20 years. But if that person is in the pursuit of a project that you're doing, and you go and have dinner with them, and other people hear about it, what are they going to say? They're not so worried maybe even about the dinner. They're going to say, you discussed things that should never been talked about. Okay. What we have in the United States, we have a term, and it's a wonderful term. It's called the dome of silence. And they say, so when you go, just imagine you get covered with this thing that if it's your best friend, you can't talk to them anymore. Okay. The conflict of interest, if it's your wife who's working for that company, you can't talk about it anymore. Okay, you cannot take don't get into the trap of gifts. Okay, now some countries, I don't know if it's the case in Sri Lanka, but in the United States, I think somebody's allowed to take you to coffee and that, but you've got to declare anything over a value of $25. You've got to then write out that somebody took me to dinner, and the dinner costs $25.50. Well, guess what? You're reporting it. okay? Because that prevents these sort of things. So no gifts.
Yeah.
So my, yes.
Sorry. Right now, we don't have any, provision to control this kind of,
Yeah.
But in our draft PFM bill, we include some provisions.
Okay, but that's important. It's really important that you prevent these inducements, these, and it can be so innocent, you know. So I have a good friend, and he invites me to go and play golf with him over the weekend. Okay, and it's at a fancy golf club, and you just don't think, you know. You get there, you go and you play golf with the person and that, and you never thought, well, how much did he pay for me to go and play golf that day? Okay. Those are so many of the things that you have to trip up. So what I would say, which is important as you take this further, that you also create some sort of guidelines on what an inducement is. Because if it's not defined, it could cause problems. So, and then they say here under point 10, if anyone ever asks you what the project management cycle is, and we're going to go into greater detail on that, but you can see the 5 phases typically of the cycle. So why have we got this document? This is very simple, okay, very simple. Section 11, basically it's the description of the roles and duties of all these different bodies that are going to be involved in it. From the line ministries, and the NAPPP, Ministry of Finance, etc., they are all involved in that. Okay, so let's look at the process. So I'm just going to very briefly just run through it, and I'm not going to go in great detail. But what you have are a whole series of decision-making processes which are included in the phases in the document details that we're going through. So it's from the idea that somebody initiates to approvals. If it's not approved, there could be a rejection process. You'll see that this is repeated throughout. The decisions are carried further. So what you'll see is throughout the process that we're going to describe in this document, and if this was printed in color, you would see it better, that there are certain checkpoints, and the words, if not approved, it returns backwards for further review. Okay? If not approved, it's going to return back for further review constantly, so that you can ensure that everyone has signed off on this. And this also fits into the whole sense of what happens if the different ministers disagree or whatever. When it gets to the cabinet and the final sign-off is made and every cabinet minister agrees to it, then it doesn't really matter what party they come from in the end, because they signed on to that project. So let's look at section 13. Okay, this is the main question that is always, yes?
NPC has the, according to the Constitution, 19th Amendment, they have the power or mandate for making the policy on the procurement,
Yes.
and the monitoring and the reporting.
Yeah.
Those are the things. Now we are putting here some actions on operation.
Okay.
I think NPC has no mandate to do the operation. So my suggestion is this is for, I don't know, this we call the National Agency for PPP,
Yes.
or somebody else. The appointing members, I think, is a job of public finance. I'm not
Okay.
too sure, but we have to
Okay.
get the advice from the Attorney General, because before you are putting, this is the first time you are, after the introduction of NPC, getting the mandate for NPC is first time we are going to publish.
Okay.
So better we can get some concurrence from the clarity on from the Attorney General on this.
Yeah, and that's a good comment that you made, because I've had the last few days some comments in that regard as well, that there needs to be clear definition between operations, maintenance, and then the selections. So you've got that. Thank you. Yes.
David, can I add one more point?
Yeah.
So that's Pradeep's comment. Actually, the demarcation of responsibilities of the NPC and the Ministry of Finance is a matter to be, I think, there is a paper prepared, and I think Department of Public Finance has prepared the comments and sent it to the NPC, which is pending. I think Pradeep's comment is very, very valid, because according to the constitutions, regulatory and monitoring and oversight function is vested with NPC, whereas the operational aspect is still vested with the relevant ministries and with the leadership of the Ministry of Finance. So with that directions or the thinking, I think there are certain changes to be done to this fourth draft guideline. In fact, Mr. Algam, when he was here, he was discussing with me to make those suggestions, and we are working on it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for pointing that out. We don't want to give the authority to the wrong organizations or cause confusion in these guidelines. Okay, then we talk about the roles and responsibilities of the line ministries. So this is the next group of stakeholders. Okay, so they're responsible for ensuring the delivery of services and infrastructure projects. That's why you have the ministries, you understand it. The line ministries will also have the following responsibilities with advice from the national, I'm going to just call it from now on the NAP. It's easier to say that than the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships, but from the NAP. Okay. Now there's one thing that's going to, I think it's going to evolve over time also that you will need to track, is typically ministries are the originators of the projects, the PPP, okay? Because you're going to say, we want this PPP. I've heard that there's a situation that might occur, and this you'll have to sort out, that the NAPPP is also saying that it might originate some projects. Okay, but that's a challenge, because the question that you have to ask is, do you want the NAP coming to you and saying, here's a project we want you to do, when you don't want to do it, because it's still going to be your responsibility. Okay, so you need to just be aware that when these discussions take place of where projects originate, typically in most countries, the PPPs originate in the ministry. And that makes sense, okay? And that's why that language is there. Okay, so what will you be doing? The ministries, this is you folks, you'll identify the projects, okay? You will complete and submit pre-feasibility studies. So what is important is you're going to have a team that is thinking about projects. So I'll take the Ministry of Defense or their procurements. You've got systems that you know you want, okay? You have your experts that are sitting and they are saying, we need these systems, we need this. Let's come up with the concept, okay? And then you come up with a pre-feasibility study, which is more of a concept paper, and you say, okay, this is where we want to go. But it's a concept paper, isn't 5 pages. This could be 100 pages. This is a detailed project, okay? And that feasibility study then has to be passed upwards, okay, to the committee to be approved at first as a concept. And why are you saying do you approve it as a concept? Because you don't want to spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of rupees preparing a project that's never going to be signed off on. Okay, so the feasibility element is really important there. You will also have to send that project or that idea, as you can see there, to the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance is going to be almost the final decision maker. Why? Because they are responsible for the finances. It's as simple as that, okay? They're responsible for defining the budget, they're defining what the country can afford, etc., and they work with the Treasury, etc. And it's important because you don't want to have projects that don't have merit and that become a problem. And the Procurement Commission can also help if you need that. Phase 2, which is the project feasibility and analysis, you will then, once you have got the pre-feasibility study accepted, that's the green light or the permission to move forward with a more detailed study. And then they will look at the full feasibility studies, and that's when you we expand it, to including environmental, social, cost-benefit analysis, this thing we talked about, value for money, etc. And then you are going to prepare a cabinet paper which is sent on to the CANC. Okay, phase 3, under phase 3, where we're talking about the procurement and bidding process, you will be responsible for drafting those documents. Okay. How many of the ministries here have ever drafted a complex PPP procurement document? None, okay? That's the challenge, okay? That is the big challenge. And the question is, people ask me, what do we do? Okay. This might be the first few times that you have to hire an international consultant to come on board. If you're doing it with the World Bank, for example, they might provide that person or that support to help you. And if that fails, hopefully once the NAPPP is set up, that you'd be able to go to the NAPPP and ask them for the help with this process. You'll be responsible for soliciting expressions of interest. Do you know what an expression of interest is in EOI? Have you all heard of that? So what you're doing is you're going to test the market, you're going to come up with a concept, and you're going to publish it. If it's a very big project internationally, you're going to say, we are thinking of doing this project. Okay. This is what the project is about, this is what it entails, this is what we think the general value of it's going to be, etc. Are you interested? And you will put out a notification, and then companies domestically around the world, partnerships between domestic and international companies, will then respond to that expression of interest, and it gives you a list of companies that you can make a selection on which you think are viable companies to take further through the procurement process. And the reason for that is it's good to do this pre-filtering or this pre-selection, because you don't want to have 20 or 30 companies submitting on an RFP. It's unmanageable, okay? Because you've got to analyze everyone. You've got to pre-qualify companies, and that's what the expression of interest is all about. Okay, then you'll also review, the ministry will be responsible for reviewing the expression of interest. This is one of the things that is also important, that once you've selected your list of, in the document it says between 3 and 6, which you call it bidders, then you'll hold what they call a bidding conference. Okay, so you say on 20th of August, let's say 10th of January 2018, these 6 companies have been selected. We are inviting you to come to Colombo, to the ministry, and we are going to give you a briefing and a conference on the details of the project, give you more information, and this is a chance also for those bidders to ask questions, and everyone hears the same questions because you can't have separate conversations, and gets a great understanding of what the project is going to be about. Okay. And usually what happens, and there's a good value in having a bidders conference, that you as a ministry can get new ideas that you didn't think about, new challenges that you didn't think about, things that you might want to do, and you will refine your document and take it you will improve it, so that when it goes out for the request for proposals, it's a better project. I mean, a better document. Then the other important part is that when the request for proposal submitted and you get the responses, you get all these documents coming to your ministry, and you have to then be responsible for reviewing the documents. Okay. One of the saddest things that ever happened for a friend of mine who worked for a company is that they were going after a major proposal and they missed the deadline, the delivery deadline. Okay. Do you know about how much time? 5 minutes. Okay. They left it to the last moment, and the person got stuck in the elevator. Okay. The elevator didn't come fast enough, and they got to the desk, came running in and wanted to hand it over, and they date stamp it and time stamp it, and it was 5 minutes over, and it was cancelled. Okay. So you've got to have very, very clear indication how you're going to accept it, where you're opening it. This is all something that happens, but it's also important that you've got to have witnesses. So you've got to have public notaries that are going to witness the whole process. If somebody's late, they're late. Okay, you can't change the rules. Because what happens if there was another company that came in 5 minutes after that, another company that came in 5 minutes after that? Do you let them all? Okay, there's a reason why you have this. basically, you will also be responsible for reviewing the open bids and recommending the winning bid. So here's the roles, very simply, of the NAPPP, okay, the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships. It's new. And they can advise the ministries, they can put advisory services, as you can see. There's a whole series of functions for them there. But the important piece here is that they will be the go-to people which you can go to for help. They will have, this is really important, the data room where the information on procedures, practices, documents, and everything are stored so that it's transparent. And one of the things is, and this is important, that they will also act as witnesses when the documents are open. Not as decision makers, as witnesses, okay? Because you want to make sure that the procedures are followed correctly. Then here's the project committee. This is one of the things that was brought up, the project committee. Okay, you will have 6 to 8 members, okay? It's important that to avoid a conflict of interest in the decision-making process, that they can't be members of the CANC. Okay. And let's just have a look at who will be in this. You have a chairperson who's a representative from the ministry, and that's important because the ministry needs to be the driving force. A representative who will represent the project, who also have no voting power, and then other representatives from the list. And in this committee will be a body to provide approvals of the previous feasibility and feasibility study during phases 1 and 2. Their approvals demonstrate that the project warranted and considered provides value for money. This is the most important element here, that they're looking at providing value for money. So here, this is the phases again, approving and disapproving if it's not valid.
Page 4, now you suggest all these PPP contracts to be signed between the winning bidder and the Minister of Finance. So do you think it's practical all the PPPs to be signed by the Ministry of Finance? Because when you refer Minister of Finance, it does not mean anything. There are many departments in the Ministry of Finance. So who is really specifically responsible then? And I think it would be much better it's to be signed by the respective ministry with the concurrence of the Minister of Finance.
Okay, put that language down.
Yeah.
Okay, because you do also want to have the ministry that's going to be responsible for the project.
So
yes. Okay.
line ministry is responsible. Line ministry is the responsible, but the Minister of Finance also will be signatory because there will be a concession agreement where a lot of concession will be will have to be approved or will be agreed upon by the host government.
With the concurrence of the Minister of Finance, that would be sufficient, I think.
Yeah, or otherwise it will be a signature. And there also, David, one more thing before that, it was say 6 to 8 members. It should be 5 to 7.
Okay. Will you
It
make
should be
that?
odd number because otherwise the quorum is an issue.
Could get a hanged quorum or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's always good. That's a good point. It's always a good point to have a.
I think that the lawyers are raising something.
Okay. Yes.
Sorry, I'm just going to piggyback on the comment earlier about the approval process. I think you need to
Get the
formally
AG's opinion.
identify.
AG's opinion.
This is not the Attorney General's opinion, this is my personal opinion. But I think you need to formally and legally identify the approving authority for a PPP. And in order to do that, I think the way I understand it, first and foremost, before you finalize it in this document, you might need to get cabinet approval as to who would be, if you're going to have Ministry of Finance as the overarching approving authority, you might need concurrence on that from probably, the way I see it, from the Cabinet of Ministers, assigning that role to the Ministry of Finance for all the PPP projects across the board. But whatever said and done, I think if there is going to be a uniform authority, a uniform, like a focal point for all authority to be given for PPPs, irrespective of the line ministry who will be taking on the burden of ensuring that the implementation is successful, then that ought to be mentioned in these documents so the private investors would know that they have the correct approvals with them prior to starting that.
Okay.
And that But I also understand from the comments previously that this is a stage-by-stage process where different approvals are given at different stages, like PC, or I'm not sure whether the NAPPP is required to give any kind of approvals, but probably the cabinet appointed negotiating committee or technical evaluation committee, various approvals are given, and those signify different things, but not the ultimate approval to go ahead with the project. So that needs to be very clearly stated. And if you are going to give this authority to probably the Public Finance Department or Ministry of Finance or some corresponding authority, that needs to be mentioned very clearly. And prior to doing that, you might need to get the necessary approvals from, my understanding is the Cabinet of Ministers, but I'm not too sure on that.
Will you,
Mr. Algama would know that.
Yeah, I think just to add on it.
Yes.
One,
will you capture that?
I will.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
David, the PC project committee, there is a member of the Attorney General Department. That's there, covering the procedure of the document process onwards. But thereafter, there will be a cabinet paper for each sorry.
I'm not sure whether that is standard from the past whether there's a
No, for each previously also all the PPP project there was a cabinet decision.
Oh, no, I meant to have a member from the Attorney General's Department in a PC.
Earlier also it was there. Earlier also it was there. It had been there from the 1998 guideline also. There was a member in the project committee.
Okay.
So it had been practiced here also.
So what I just want to point out there is clarification here. If you take note here, signing of the contract with the wedding, so the ministry will sign it with the line ministry. So here's the cabinet appointed negotiating committee, the CANC. Okay. Here you can see then there's a committee also with the chairman, very similar structure. I suppose the question here we also have to ask then, is it 6 or 8 or is it 5 or 7 or something like that? It'll be a hung jury. Okay. And then this is important, that no member shall also be the member of the PC. So you can't be a member of the PC and the CANC, and the reason that is because you might have a biased opinion to the project as it moves forward. So here's the role of the Attorney Generals. So the Attorney General is involved in the decision making, and that's where the lady at the back might want to just make very sure that the language there for the Attorney General's office is correct. And if there's a problem there, let us know. But because all PPPs are defined by contracts between the government and the private sector, the Attorney General will play an important role in ensuring that all PPP contracts are legal and comply with all public sector standards, contract standards and procedures. Okay, and that's really important. And that's going to be specifically important and I'll tell you where it will be the most important is when you get a flood of unsolicited proposals, because there are going to be many, many different companies coming to ministries with great ideas, and people could get so infatuated with the idea of the project that they might skip inadvertently, I'm not saying on purpose, some of the processes, and then you get to the Attorney General's office and there's a legal problem. Okay. The role of the cabinet and the ministers, I think that's pretty straightforward. And what's important, I think is important here, is that under phase 1, which is the concept period, they can delegate power to the Ministry of Finance to appoint members to the CANC. Now what's important, one thing that I do want to stress, is that when you take any of these documents to the cabinet for approval, you need to make sure that those documents are in order, that they make sense. You need to, the person who advises the minister who's going to take it to the cabinet needs to advise the minister 100% on what this is about. Because you don't want the minister, your minister, after you've done all this hard work, standing in front of the cabinet and not being able to explain the project. Okay? So this is done with a lot of advisors behind. Okay? And then here's also, please take note here that the CCM, okay, the Cabinet Subcommittee on Economic Management, is going to have a role that's going to be very focused on unsolicited proposals. Okay. And I think that's going to be where, if I was reading in the press correctly, that the NAPPP is going to be part of the conduit for unsolicited proposals, and it will be important that they do work very closely with the CCEM. Okay, so now we're going to go through the actual process, and this is where we really need you to, we just talked about the different roles of the different players, but now we're going to talk about the process. Okay, so from identification all the way through down, and maybe a lot of the questions that you had will be better explained at this stage. So what we're looking at under section 23 is identification of projects by the line ministry. So take note that you as the line ministry are going to identify the project. So you're responsible for identifying the delivery of public services, etc. But what you're going to do is the line ministry shall consider the following characteristics in a decision to propose projects. And here are some of the things that are of importance. Priority projects. Okay. You have your list. You're not going to just do every project. These are really projects that are priority. Affordability is a term that has to be considered when you're doing your pre-feasibility. Value for money, I explained that earlier on. The capacity and the interest of the market. Now that is something that often occurs, that you will put out a procurement and you'll think that there's a tremendous amount of interest, and then one company bids. Okay, and this happens. Okay, you're faced with a dilemma then. Okay, because how do you evaluate if just that one company has absolutely the best deal ever, or if it's the worst deal, but do you take it because only one bid? Okay, that is really important. Don't consider a PPP if the market is not going to be interested in the process. And then this is one thing that's really important that you talked about, is the public interest. A number of people have mentioned, is it in the public's interest to do the project? So then you would prepare this line identification matrix listing all the projects that you are considering. And this is almost, you can also call that sort of the pipeline that I mentioned earlier on. So ministry identifies the projects according to criteria. It then gets a list of the projects, and then you have to take this further. Okay, you will prepare a pre-feasibility study. And I'm going to stress one thing, and I made a note to myself when I was going over this. I would say a pre-feasibility study, when you're preparing it, it has to be in your mind almost as good as the feasibility study. Okay, you don't want to do just a half attempt or a weak attempt with your pre-feasibility study, because if your pre-feasibility study is weak, it's likely it's not going to be approved to be taken further, or you're going to have to make so many revisions to it that it just becomes a bureaucratic nightmare. So it is important when you're talking about pre-feasibility, don't think of it as just a light document. It needs to be a very, very detailed document. Okay. Again, these large strategic projects, you heard the list that we talked about. But it's important that things that are considered must be that it's economical, financial, environmentally viable, socially, legally viable, and it needs to include some of the following factors. So you may ask, why do you put all this information in the feasibility study? Because when you're preparing a feasibility study, what are you actually preparing? You're preparing a marketing study, because you're going to put that out. Eventually, it's going to become the document in the RFP that you're going to put out for the public, the private sector, to consider. So they need to understand, why was this project chosen, but all the decision makers are going to need to understand, why did you choose it? You need to have a very detailed, as perfect as possible, project description, size, location, who's going to use it, what it consists of, etc. The sectoral analysis is the appropriateness of the project for development within the context of relevant sectors. The public sector comparator, that's a new term, and I'll explain that very briefly. It's a complicated term, but it's not, you don't have to be a genius to understand it. And what it is, the public sector comparator is, you have to do a study before you start the project, in the feasibility, to determine if we decided to do the project ourselves, what would it cost us to do? Okay. Because if you haven't done that, you can't compare it with what the private sector comes up with. So the public sector comparator is your threshold study that determines what we would, if we decided we're going to do it, what is it going to cost us to do it? And then when you get later on, way down the process, you get all the responses from the private sector, you can do a comparison. And the reason, it's very simple. If you feel you could do it for $10 million and everyone else is coming to you and it says it's going to take $30 million, okay? There's two problems there. Either your feasibility study was very weak and you didn't understand the market, or it's the private sector it doesn't understand the costs, and you have to make the decision then, are we going to do it or are we going to let the private sector do it? So please, if you don't know what the public sector comparator is, make sure you understand that concept. You also have to describe the form of the contract, the implementation plan, how we're going to do it, the costs, and at times this may vary because if it's a very sophisticated PPP, you might not have an absolute example or an understanding of what the costs are going to be. So you would have the, but you want to have a certain comfort with the level of costs so that when the private sector proposes costs, you can make a comparison. The preliminary financial model, we're talking about preliminary in the pre-feasibility because as you advance that study to a feasibility study, you might come up with more information that will revise your model. And then the risk assessment. Okay. One of the things that's important about PPPs is when you go into the agreement with the private sector, you are going to give them a certain amount of the risks. They're going to take on a certain amount of risks. You need to have a very clear understanding of what those risks are. And importantly also who's going to be responsible for them. Don't move forward unless you have a government financial support assessment as well. Okay? Is the government willing to support it and to provide guarantees? Okay. So under Section 25 then is the appointment of the PC by the NPC. Okay, here you can see who the members are again. And we'll take into consideration the numbers again. This is an important one. This is always a bit of a controversial element. An honorarium to be paid to the members for their time. Okay, and I hear that that is a bit of a general practice in Sri Lanka that honorariums are paid. Okay, so what you're doing is you're paying somebody a little bit of extra money to be on the selection committee. But this has been set at 40,000 rupees, and please take note that it's no more than 40,000, and it's a once-off payment. And why do they say that? Because if you don't say it's a once-off payment, the committee could extend it and extend it and extend it and demand more and more money for their time. Okay, so an honorarium is considered. So you get your pre-feasibility study. It goes for review and approval by the PC. So here the PC shall review and disapprove the pre-feasibility analysis submitted by the line ministry. And important, if it's not improved, it can go back for further analysis. If it's really bad, it would end there. Okay. But if it's not a bad one, if there's further clarification needed, it can go back and then it can return. So once you've done the pre-feasibility study, you're then getting to the concept paper by the line ministry. And what is the concept paper? So you have a concept paper that summarizes the key information that you've formed in your pre-feasibility study. And the paper shall be submitted by the line ministry to the Ministry of Finance for its review and approval. And I suppose the question that you'll want to ask there is who in the Ministry of Finance is going to review that, and that can be clarified. And then if it's approved, it just demonstrates that the project further warrants consideration. Then you have the vetting and the disapproval of the concept paper. The Ministry of Finance will approve or disapprove. And if not approved, then it can go for further review again. Here you talk about the appointment of the CANC by the Ministry of Finance. If the paper is needed, you need a CANC. So you'll get the CANC is appointed.
Now actually, conceptual level review of the projects is done by the Department of National Planning.
Yes.
As of now, the department does not come under the purview of the Ministry of Finance actually. It comes under a different ministry.
Okay.
Therefore, I think we have to change the wording. It may not be necessarily the Ministry of Finance. The department which is in charge of reviewing these projects.
Okay, thank you for that. So now you're getting to, you've got the concept paper, people have signed off, there's a general feeling that it's worthwhile to carry forward, the ministries have signed off, the Attorney General's office has reviewed it. Yes?
Officials of the Department of National Planning and Department of External Resources. They also serve as a member of the procurement committees.
Okay.
So, but these two departments are under the purview of different ministries, as we said.
Okay.
So here you better mention that representative from the Treasury. Those departments are considered as Treasury departments.
Okay. So you will.
Yeah, I have mentioned.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so now you're going to prepare the detailed feasibility study, which is just an advanced version of the pre-feasibility study. Here you can see there's different elements that are included in it. So I'm not going to go through all the details, but this you can read. It's very simple. It needs to be technically feasible. It needs to be legally feasible. That is really important. There needs to be an economic cost-benefit analysis and value for money done. There you can see the VFM that I mentioned, the term there. Financial feasibility. There's risk assessment that needs to be done. Once you've got the feasibility study put together, you will then have the PC reviewing it, approving or disapproving the feasibility analysis that is submitted by the line ministry. And if not approved, the line ministry has to review, but if it is approved, it moves forward. Then there's a cabinet paper that is prepared by the ministry. Okay? For each feasibility study analysis, there's approval. The line ministry shall prepare a cabinet paper, summarize the key information. The cabinet shall present the proposed PPP structure and feasibility analysis to demonstrate why the project would be a good investment decision. And this is the important thing. The cabinet is going to want to be sure that it's a good investment decision. And then it will include the procurement strategy, how you're going to procure it, what is qualitative, comparative analysis of the different procurement methods. So you need to have a good rationale on the feasibility, the economic feasibility, the good investment decision, how you're going to do it and why you're going to do it. And then this goes to the CANC for review of approval and disapproval. So here there's, again, the CANC shall review and approve the cabinet paper. It goes through the whole thing. It reconfirm the project stakeholder management requirements can be met, that the project is affordable, this is important, that it will provide better value for money, and here that it's a clear public priority for implementation as a PPP. This is where it gets very difficult with unsolicited proposals. That's one of the areas where it's difficult to determine absolutely if it is in the interest of the public priority, or if it is a public priority. If approved, it demonstrates that the project offers value for money and shall continue. If not approved, then it can be referred back. So this is one of the loops, one of the checks and balances. Now, this is where you start preparing the procurement documents, okay? So here we're looking at the bidding documents that are going to be prepared by the line ministry. Take note, okay? The ministry is going to prepare those. Again, this is where you could go for help to the NAPPP if you need help, if you don't have the resources. But you are going to go through the following steps, and you need to have the following. You need a request for qualifications, okay? So this is where you ask the companies clearly to define why they are qualified to do the project. You also do a request for proposals. You need to define the tender schedule, and there's details a little later on that. The rules, okay, who can participate, okay, the target, the capital investment, okay, the information memorandum, you've got to put an information memorandum that provides the information, the draft contracts. It's critically important that you put draft contracts in this initial procurement, because the companies want to know when they are starting to procure, when they face chasing the procurement, what the terms and conditions are going to be under the contract. You need also the performance bond. This is a very important element under a PPP. that they have to have a bond that they could forfeit if they don't meet the conditions. Technical and financial proposed formats, and then the minimum acceptable price. Okay, this is something that you keep yourself. You don't tell the private sector what that minimum price is. Okay, you need to have an understanding that if the project is cheaper than that, then they maybe don't have an understanding of what the project's going to cost. Yes.
This process is fine, that there are certain small language changes as well. There is not word called tender, it should be proposal schedule. And also here, performance bond, the bond word should be security.
Okay.
So those we can make changes.
Okay. So you prepare the draft contract, and the reason why I say draft, because as you get closer and closer to award, you might start finding information that results in you refining the contract. Okay, but you've got to have, again, under that, the technical parameters very, very clearly defined. The concession period, so is it a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year, 25-year contract? The concession rights and obligations, so who is obliged to do what and who has what rights. There's the government rights and obligations. Remember that both parties have rights, and so it's important that this is clearly defined. The concession fee, the risk-benefit allocation, and this is a difficult one because you've got to decide who takes on what risk. And this gets very difficult, and if you have trouble with that, this is where you need to hire experts who can help you come up with a risk-benefit analysis. And the private sector, you need to listen very carefully to this. Many times the private sector say, we'll take on all the risk. But what is the risk of that? They're going to make you pay for that. Okay. Any private company will take on the risk, but you will pay for it. You've got to find that balance of what risks you're going to take, what risks you're going to allocate to the private sector, so that you can manage the cost of the project. How are you going to implement the project? The user fee. This is an interesting element, and there's two ways generally of fees that can be considered. Okay, it's easy, for example, if you're doing a toll road, because when people pay to use the toll road, there's a fee that's agreed to, and that determines the revenue. But sometimes if it's a healthcare project, like a hospital, the government might subsidize the fee for users because it could be too expensive. So you've got to have a very, very clear understanding of the fee. The construction, you will put that into your document as well. Operation and maintenance needs to be discussed. Now, the right for substitution, this is an important element. It says the contract should provide substitution rights so that the concession can be transferred to another company or individual in the event of failure of the concessionaire to operate the project successfully. So what you're saying there is, if the PPP is being badly managed, you have great concerns that the company doesn't know how to manage it, they are possibly going to default, they're going to go bankrupt, etc., and that you need to state the language of how a transfer could take place to another company, because you want to ensure the survivability of that project. You don't want that project to come to a dead standstill, because the minute it comes to a stop, you're going to have costs. Do you understand what I mean by force majeure? It's an act of nature. Some countries call it an act of God, depending which country you're in. And these are things like earthquakes. You had a major, oh, that's a bad expression, you had a very large force majeure event in your history a few years ago with the tsunami that came in, okay, and it devastated large parts of this country. Just imagine if there was a large PPP project on the coastline and it was destroyed by the tsunami. You have to clearly define who was going to be responsible for that. Typically, force majeure risk is covered by the government. Okay, that's important to note. The private sector will gain, they will take it, but then they're going to do what? They're going to take out major insurance, and major insurance costs a lot of money, and the government will pay for it anyway. Okay. Termination. So you cannot just cancel a project. And I'm going to tell you an interesting story. I was in Saudi Arabia earlier this year. Okay. If you've been following the news about Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of interesting and crazy things that are happening there at the moment. But one of the things that happened was I was talking to a very senior Saudi government official, and he said to me, David, when Saudi Arabia recovers its oil and gas prices, okay, and the oil gets back to where we want to, and we have all the money that we're used to having, can we just cancel all the PPP projects? Okay? And, I thought, well, that's a bit of a strange. I said, oh, you can cancel them all if you want to, but guess what? You're going to pay a lot of money. Okay? You don't just walk away from a PPP project. It costs. If you decide that you're going to rescind the project for whatever your reason is, unless it's poor performance, okay, it's going to cost you. And another person, a friend of mine, described PPPs like a marriage. Okay? A PPP is like a marriage. It can be a very happy marriage or it can be an extremely unhappy marriage. Okay? But read the terms and conditions of that marriage. Okay? Don't make the mistake that I made when I married my wife. She's American, I'm South African. I didn't read the little bit that when you get married to me, you are moving to the United States. I didn't understand that. The day after we got married, I said to my wife, when are you moving to South Africa? And she looked at me as if I was crazy, and I found myself moving to the United States. Okay? Read those clauses. Okay? Understand, because if you don't define clearly how a project is terminated, the processes, who's at fault, who's right, what the divorce agreements are, who gets what, who gets the cat, who gets the dog, who gets the budgie, okay? If you don't do that, you are going to enter into a massive legal fight that will cost a lot of money. And one of the things, if I can ever give you a bit of advice, try arbitration before you go to the divorce, okay? Because the ultimate responsibility, the ultimate thing that you want is the success of the project. Even if you have to go to marriage counseling, you want to ensure that that project is going to be successful, because a failed PPP project is a terrible thing. You've got to understand also the monitoring and the supervision, who's responsible for what. That one is really important, the handover plan. Okay. Remember I talked about that with that project in Central America where it was going so well that 3 years after the contract ended, they were still running the contract. They hadn't, looked at the handover plan. Okay. That is important. And why is the handover plan most important? It's one of the very first things I said this morning was that when you do a PPP, after the 25 years or the 30 years, that asset goes back to who? To you guys. And you want to determine how that project's going to look when it comes back to you. You don't want to get something that's not working, falling apart, and is terrible and is a money loser, okay? So you need to put in every bit of information that you can for the handover plan. Also, government support and guarantees, you need to state what you're willing to guarantee and what not. And that's very controversial and very difficult for countries because every country has a different one. Dispute resolution, we talked about that.
David?
Yes?
I think it's very important, in principle, if you could include these three clauses also. In fact, we can discuss that. One is the stepping right in the
Yes.
PPP. Second one is the bonus, renegotiation clause.
Yeah.
When there is a disaster, there's circumstances that also we can. The other one is the what you call sharing of super profit.
Yeah.
So those three are very important because we have made enough blunders in the past.
Yeah.
So those were permitted mainly because those were absent.
Do you understand?
In whatever the guideline that we prepare, now
Yeah.
this new guideline, those three things to be there.
Okay. Do you understand what the super profit element is? Sometimes projects perform so well that they make more money than they expected, and then the government expects to be paid more, but if you haven't got that clause put in there, you're not getting it. You can try, you can cry, you can do whatever, because what they will say to you, if it didn't make money and it was losing money, the private sector would be responsible for it. So you need to have those clauses. So the Attorney General's office, this is really important again, will conduct a review of the documents. Then there will be the CA and CSHA reviews and approve. And then you will go to the next phase so that you've got all the documents, your feasibility studies done, you've got your concept paper, you've got your procurement documents, you've got your information package that you want. Now you are going to share it with the private sector. Okay. And you don't want to do that until you're ready, because any bit of information that's missing, bad information, wrong information, missing information, will result in a really, really bad procurement process, especially in military systems. Okay. You have to have the specifications down to the minute detail, otherwise you're going to get a system that you didn't want. Okay. So what they do here is you've got this, you've got all that, now you start the process of an expression of interest. So you're going to start soliciting the expression of interests. The invitation should be given the widest publicity to ensure full and open competitive bidding. And that's the question that sometimes ministries are very reluctant to broadcast it too much, because they want, out of nationalistic intentions, they want it to be only for their country, or because, you know, the reasons are vast. But depending on the sophistication and the size of the project, it's better to make sure that you also get international coverage. Where do you advertise it? You advertise it in things like the Economist magazine, and there are specialist industry websites that everyone's interested. Military contracts are a little different. Sometimes it's very difficult that you wouldn't just do a general procurement, because there's national interests and secrets and all those scary things behind it that you don't want to share with other countries. But it's important here that you will have the rules also, and then also important, you know, the bidders have to declare any conflicts of interest, because you don't want to disqualify somebody after a lot of effort. Okay, so once you have got the expression of interest and you get the responses, so the ministry will receive the responses. You can work with you'd work with the NAPP to review the responses and provide the recommendations for the pre-qualified bids. Okay, so this is a whole process, but things that you would look at: the bidder's experience, ability to deliver, financial strength, and the ability to provide contractual arrangements. I'm going to give you one little thing that you should also be very careful of. When you're evaluating bidders, sometimes it might be worth it also for you to consider going to the World Bank site and that, to have a look at companies or institutions that have been barred because of bad practices, etc. You need to do some of your own due diligence as well to ensure that the information that they provide you is correct. And based on the nature of the project, you may also specify certain specific criteria, and you will have a team of experts. Now, you can understand that, I'm sure you'll understand that very simply, that a project initiated by the Ministry of Transport versus a PPP by the Ministry of, or the military is going to be, or what's the Ministry of Defense, is quite different, okay? So don't fall into that trap of just having standard procurement documents. I would be very concerned if the NAPPP, as it evolves, for example, starts issuing a standard set of procurement documents for PPPs and says, use this all the time, and then you just took it and used it without, how would you call it, customizing it specifically for your use, because there are so many different factors. No PPP is the same as the other. So once that you go through the process, this is a question that is often asked. Should there be a fee required for those documents? And this is touchy, okay? But there's two reasons why a fee is good, and there's maybe a reason why a fee isn't good. Having a fee for the procurement documents is good because it means that only serious companies are going to bid, okay? Because you get some companies that just bid on everything, hoping that they're going to get the lottery and win a project, okay? You want to avoid that. But the other is you've got to define what the market is willing to pay as a fee for those documents. Because if it's too high, you might have good companies that just decide they're not going to do it. Okay? And that's something that you guys will have to determine what the willingness is of the market to pay fees for any sort of documents or for procurements. So you've got your selected companies, you've done your expression of interest, you've got your short list now. Typically, as I said, you like somewhere between about 3 and 6 highly qualified companies so that you can make a fair choice. You'll now then start working on the RFP, and this you are only going to send to the pre-qualified companies. These are the things that you will have included: the introduction, terms of reference, the financial proposals, technical evaluation, and selection process. This is critical, okay, the evaluation and that. You need to define that very, very carefully. You can't change your selection rules after you've submitted, because you will be protested, and there'll be other organizations that say this is not fair. Okay. So you've got just, this is a lot of just information that is proposed that you should include. You can see there under procedures for contesting of bids needs to be very clear. The amount that's going to be paid, the time limit, etc. That's so important. I hope this is in compliance with Sri Lankan law, but it's suggested that 90 days be considered for that. If anyone thinks that's wrong, let us know, but I bet you, I think it was based on your procurement guidelines, that there is a 90-day turnaround for a PPP. The only thing that I would say there, and remember these are guidelines, these are not absolute, that sometimes if you're going for a very, very complicated procurement, if it's a major port or a major airport or something like that, 90 days might not be enough. Okay, so again, it's a guideline. This is not the law. Okay, they're saying that typically about 90 days is good, but just think if you're going to, if you want to, depending on how complicated your response is that you're requesting from a company, 90 days might not be enough for them to respond. It's not uncommon sometimes for 120 days or whatever, but you don't want to stretch it out forever as well, because that's when companies lose interest. The data room that I mentioned early on is really important. This is a depository for all the information and documents and everything so that companies can get the documents they need. Usually if they have a fee that they have to pay, then they'll get a passcode or something that gives them access to the documents. You don't always make the information for the procurement fully available. Again, you will have a bidders conference. Now there's a lot of detail in the bidders conference, but the biggest value for the bidders conference is that you will have the 6 or 7 or whatever you've pre-qualified in the room. They get to ask all the questions that they want to ask in front of everyone. And why do you do that? For transparency and for competitiveness. Because if you allow individual conversations with companies, you could inadvertently give somebody an advantage. You could say something that gives them, you could be accused of favoritism, etc. So it's really important that if you want to clarify the document, that you have a bidders conference where everything is done in public, and by that I mean not necessarily with the public there, but with it's open, everyone can hear the same questions, get the same answers. Now I can tell you one thing, a secret from the private sector. When I used to go to bidders conferences, we were very careful in what questions we asked, because we didn't want to give away our competitive edge in, if I would say, but you don't explain this and this, and it means we're thinking about it, other companies might not have been thinking about it. So sometimes you will get good information out of a bidders conference, other times you might have a room of people just staring at you, okay? But it's important to have that bidders conference. Things that will happen is it should be held no less than 3 weeks before the due date. And the reason is, especially if it's a very complex document, people might have missed something, and 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks, you're just not going to have time to revise your response to the proposal. And often sometimes companies just decide they're not going to go further after that. Now this is important, that you will have a situation that at the bidders conference new ideas will come forward that you didn't think of, clarifications, all sorts of questions that will be asked. You will take the comments that were received. You have to write written responses to all the questions, and importantly, take note here, send copies of all of these to all the parties that were involved. That's important, okay? Because every party that's going to bid needs to understand what the questions were that were asked and what the answers, so that no one gets an unfair advantage. Something can happen. Just take note here. There's this comment here. If answers to the clarifications received during the bidders conference or in writing will affect the RFP, because sometimes the private sector might bring up something that you didn't even think of, okay? Or you may have made a mistake and they've brought it out. Then the line ministry shall revise and resubmit the RFP to pre-qualified bidders. And this has happened to me before, where we thought we were ready, 24 hours away from delivering it, and we get an email that pops up on a screen and said, due to concerns raised at the bidders conference, we have decided to revise the RFP and provide additional information. Okay, that is not uncommon. Okay. But you need to do that process. If you find an error that's going to cause you problems, or an oversight, or something that got forgotten, or you didn't include it, you need to make it available and then reissue the RFP. And usually what that can also result in is that you start the countdown again for another submission, okay? Or you'll extend the submission date and say, instead of submitting it by October the 3rd, it's now going to be November the 7th or something like that. So that there's adequate time for people to do it. So it says here, if the major change is made, the time frame given for submission of proposals should be extended accordingly. Okay, there's the mention of proposal guarantees. Okay, this is, will accompany the proposal specified. This is including things as bank guarantees, surety bonds, standby letters of credit, checks, etc. This is one of the most important requirements of a PPP procurement, and I'll tell you why. You don't want to select a company that is strong technically and then find out that they cannot meet the financial conditions of the contract, and you disqualify them. Okay. The other is, once the award is made, okay, you give usually about a month or whatever to the private sector to finalize the finance, and they've got to go back to the investors, they've got to put the whole package together. If they have problems, you have wasted a lot of time. And this is why there has a term, and you'll see a little later on, where they talk about a reserve company. So you will prioritize company 1's the strongest, 2, 3, or whatever, that if number 1 fails for whatever reason, once you've made the award, you can then go to number 2. And hopefully they're good enough to consider them as a second one. But you need these guarantees. And the guarantee has to be unconditional from an approved local bank and redeemable by the government with no restrictions. So it's only valid if you're going to use that guarantee that it's immediately available. But one of the things is there is opening of the proposals. So imagine this scenario, okay, and it describes it there. The proposals arrive, okay, sealed. Don't ever receive one that's not sealed, okay, in sealed packages. Typically for a PPP, there will be 2 packages. One is the technical and the other is the financial, in separate envelopes. If they come together, what do? You disqualify them. Okay, it's the condition that's put in there. 2 separate documents. The most important thing is it needs to be date stamped, verified that it was received. You will lock those up in a safe, okay? Especially if it's, some people might give it 3 or 4 days before the final date, and you always get the people at the last minute that deliver. You can't have those documents lying around because they'll be tampered with, okay? Locked in a safe. When you're ready, then you are going to do the opening. So the line ministry shall open the bids and open them publicly at the time and place and in the manner specified in the request for proposals. So you need to say in the request of the proposals when you're going to open it, how you're going to open it, where you're going to open it. Okay. You need witnesses. bidders also, the bidders may choose to attend, and in most times, if it's a major project, the bidders will be there. They want to be in the room. So you could have a room like this with all the documents up front, okay? And have you ever seen a major bidding document? Sometimes it's 4 or 5 major boxes. It's not just something like that, okay? The person who's opening it will open it, read out the name of the company, what it consists of, all the documents, and it's recorded publicly so that there's no dispute that that company didn't give something, or they were given special treatment. It says, line ministry may in exceptional circumstances defer the date for opening and bids and record in writing the reasons therefor. So if somebody who's critical on your bid committee got ill or something like that, or something happened, you can do it. But that is not a process you want to follow, or let's say consider, unless it's absolutely necessary. And then all bidders who have transferred or submitted their bids shall be permitted by the line ministry to participate in the opening of the technical bids. And you need to keep minutes, records of the proceedings, because all these records and documents of the whole process are going to go into the final storage of documents related for that document for future reference if there's any disputes. We were looking at the, just before lunch, we started looking at the evaluation. So we talked about how you open the proposals. It has to be opened in public, so that everyone that can see that they're witnesses. And then you've got the documents, and that's the next part that we are then going on to, is the technical evaluation. And there's 2 evaluations typically for PPPs. There's a technical evaluation and a financial evaluation. Typically, and this should be the golden rule, and it states here, you always do the technical evaluation first. Okay. Many countries have this crazy tendency that they want to have the cheapest project, and then they focus too much on the financial. And yes, and I'll say something. I think if it's really cheap, sometimes you get cheap things. Okay, it's like buying, really good quality, or something that could be risky. But let's look at the technical evaluation. So basically, there are criteria that you have included, and it says there you have the criteria which you included in the RFP. You can't come up with new evaluation criteria afterwards. You've got to have that evaluation criteria there in the document, because when I used to write responses and RFPs to proposals, we would look at the technical evaluation points on that, and that's how we would structure our whole document. So it states they included in the request for proposal the evaluation criteria can contain, and there's following information. Now, every type of project is going to have its own evaluation criteria, so we can't give you an exclusive list, and it depends on the ministry. Also might have its own specific criteria as well, based on procedures. But the typical ones there, the information, technical capacity evaluation of the project experience. This is one of the most important, because you want to choose a company that's got the experience, the understanding of the scope of work. And that is one of the things that's really important with PPPs, because one thing that you look for PPPs is innovation. You're looking for new ideas. And so you are going to evaluate people. You will give a description of what you want, but you are going to evaluate them on how innovative they are with these ideas against those criteria. And that is quite important. The technical solution, that's part of the innovation, the approach, and the methodology that is proposed as well. For a PPP, the business plan is important, because this is a long-term commitment, and then any of the other things that you've defined in your RFP. So what you'll do is then you'll allocate marks or a score. I think you've all seen these documents. There's the technical evaluation, and there's a certain score, usually adds up to like 100 or something like that. And you will load the different scores and say, 10 for this, 5 for that, whatever it is, and you go through that process. The notification, once you've made you then have to tell the bidders whether they pass the minimum requirement. Okay, this is important. You don't want bidders sitting there for 6 months wondering if they won or not, or if they got anything. It's really important for bidders' confidence to let them know as soon as possible. The question that you will also ask yourself there is, if you've got 6 bidders, for example, how many of those are you going to accept as technically reaching the goal? You might decide you're going to have, as I said, the best and then a reserve bidder in case they don't meet the conditions. Or you might choose 3 out of them and tell 3 that they've reached. There's a whole process of how you can do this. But I would never go through the process of just telling one that they were the exclusive. So it's best to give, a sense that, this is, you were ranked number 1, number 2, number 3, you met the requirements and state that. And then 4, 5, and 6, sorry, you didn't meet the requirements and you're not in the rest of the process. So you go there, you make the information available, and here it says the line ministry also make available to any person the names of the bidders whose technical proposals have passed. Only bidders whose technical proposals have passed are entitled to participate further in the proceedings. And you've got to make that very clear. If you didn't make it, we're sorry. Better luck next time. Try whatever again. But here you are going to go through the next process. So then you have these 2 or 3 or 4, whatever. You're going to look at now the financial bid. And this is important. So you will have a look. You will have remember we talked about the public sector comparator earlier on. You'll have your threshold, your comparison. You have a sense of generally what the project's going to cost. And then you will have a minimum score, and those don't meet it will then also be told that you didn't make it. But you never, and it states it there, you never open the financial bids of those who didn't pass the technical qualifications. And the reason for that is very simple, is because you don't want to be tempted to then maybe revise the technical evaluation because the financial offer was so good. Do you see what I'm saying? That can happen. So it's like the gift that you will never know what's in the package, okay? You send it back to them if they're not selected, and this is recommended here. So then in preparation here of the financial evaluation, the line ministry with the support of the NAPP will have developed capital and operating cost estimates, so you have your values that you're going to compare it against. The line ministry should have also established a minimum acceptable price, which you then also will do the cross bid against that. And then any financial bids that fall below the minimum price shall not be considered for award of the bid. And that is really a difficult process to come up with what your minimum price is. Because you might be in the situation that you've never done a project like that before and you don't understand what the financial costs could be. And this is where, again, working with the NAPPP as they established, you could also find that they could provide you with consultants or whatever to come up with what you estimate the fair cost to be. But you do need to have that evaluated. It says here also that you select the winning bidder are ranked in accordance. In the event the first bidder withdraws or is not selected for some reason, the line minister may request bidders to extend their prospective guarantees as necessary. So you'll say to number 2, you're lucky. Number 1 didn't make it. Okay, you're up. Now we need you to extend your guarantees, carry on. One of the things that will happen is sometimes the bidding process and the review can take longer than expected. It could take 6 months. You just don't know. There's something that could happen. And you have to check and this is why they talk about extending the bidding guarantee, that the companies that put in a proposal with certain costs, certain things that they were going to do, if they still agree to those terms that they put in their contract. Because if they don't, then you wouldn't consider them as well. And most times companies will put in that our proposal is valid for 1 year or something like that. You might want to ask that up front, give a clear indication of how long you want that guarantee to be valid for. So if the first one fails, you will consider selecting the second bidder or the second ranked, and they could be the winning bidder. What is important is to announce as soon as possible, And here it's recommended within 5 days that the selection has been made. Also, you want the line ministry to tell the other bidders that they didn't make it. You need to be very clear and very quick with that information, because if there's big silence and nothing is said, people could start making speculations that the bid was manipulated, there was, behind the scenes, manipulation and that. The sooner you make the decision the sooner you let people know about the decision, the better it is for anyone. And then this is important, is you've also got to tell the winning bidder, that within 7 days, it's stated here, that they need to confirm that they accept that they've won. Okay, and it sounds very strange, but sometimes companies change their minds. Okay, and the reason for that is very quickly because you do want to see that if the winning bidder turns it down, and it happens sometimes, that the secondary or the secondary company can then be notified that they are the what you call it, the actual winner. Contesting can take place, and it's not uncommon with very, very large international procurements for it to be contested. And this is why you need to keep all the records of how you evaluated, what the decision process was, when things were opened, how, everything like that. So that if there's a contest and it goes through the courts or anything like that, that you've got the information available to sit down and defend your decision. This can be also in certain countries difficult when there's attempts for political manipulation of contracts, that you need to be wary and ready so that that doesn't happen. So let's look at the challenge that sometimes you can get to a situation where you think you've got a fantastic bid, you only get one company that bids. Okay, what do? And there's a recommendation that's made there. If you have a sole bid or only one bidder, you can accept the bid if you are convinced that it is a good one, or the only other option is to reject it if there's only one, because you can't really do that competitive comparison just with one. The other challenge is, and this happens, you might not believe it, but sometimes two companies can actually be scored the same. Okay, so there's two winning bids. Okay, and this is where you enter into sort of a negotiation with two. And you'll hear this term, if you haven't heard of it, it's used very regularly, BAFO, B-A-F-O, best and final offer. And then you take the two companies and say, okay, you both scored. You need to tell them that you both scored the same. Now we're looking at the financial evaluation or the technical evaluation. What is your final offer? And you don't tell anyone what the other one scored, what their value was. Okay? And you come up with a new decision here. And then you will choose the one who offered the most advantages. It's got to go to Cabinet for approval. This is important. And it's really important, I think, now in Sri Lanka that there is Cabinet review and approval, because there have been a lot of projects in the past that ministries just pushed through without national consensus or national agreement on the validity of the projects. And that's going to be, I think, one of the areas where it could be challenging if there's political disagreement on projects. And the same here, you can see there's a comment there. If the Cabinet doesn't approve the selection, the second bidder and the accompanying documents could then be submitted to the Cabinet of Ministers for approval through a majority vote. So the Cabinet might have the final decision. It says here also, if any proposal has been issued previously is revised after the lapse of 1 year from choosing the closing date of a proposal, the process must begin again at section 32. So what you're saying is, if there's a delay of a year in making the award, you have to start the process essentially again. And why is that? For PPPs, it's really important because of the financials. Things could have changed. Labor costs could have changed. Tax rates could have changed. Interest rates could have changed. There's so many things that, or there could be a new technology that's suddenly that's been introduced that made the last proposal not so great anymore. So now you look at the contract post-award period and contract signature. So negotiations, please take note. This is one of the most important things. No negotiations of materials issued shall take place between the line ministry and the winning bidder after the due date. So what are they saying there? Is you can't change the contract terms after the project's been awarded. The most important thing is you can't negotiate new terms once the contract is awarded, because what are you doing? You're changing the whole procedure, you're changing the whole procurement, and you could be accused of giving unfair advantage to the company that won. Okay, and that happens. It happens extremely commonly that you'll have the situation that companies will say, okay, now we've won, we want to start, but we don't agree with this, we don't agree with this, we don't agree with this, we want this changed. And I'm not going to say which country and whatever project, but I was reading about in the newspaper here recently a certain port and a certain oil refinery, and there were all sorts of changes that were being suggested. Okay, you can't do that because you're changing the terms, and then all the other companies that could have actually offered a better solution didn't get chosen. Okay. So, people say that the difficulties are the negotiations. There are negotiations once the award is done, but that would be on simple little things like a mobilization date. When are you going to start? You say you have to mobilize in 10 days, but you could agree maybe we need 15 days because something is, happening. Or there's a big natural disaster and you can't get to the site, that sort of thing. Or if it's monsoon and there's a flooding, and you can't start the project. Those are the types of things you negotiate, but you're not going to negotiate what is built, how it's built, what the costs are, those type of things. That is just absolutely not allowed under any circumstances. So it says in negotiations of non-material conditions as they rate to the evaluation criteria may take place. Subject also then it says the finalization. Basically, the Ministry of Finance and the line ministry shall execute the PPP contract with the winning bidder within 20 days of award. So we had the discussion a little earlier on this morning about the ministry would sign, the Ministry of Finance would sign. If you are aware of any other people that should sign, please make a note, okay, so that we don't miss that opportunity. Okay, then there's the publication of a white book. And what this is basically all the tender documents. It's the record of the whole process, okay? Except I think the thing that you wouldn't include in the white book is, remember we talked about intellectual property, if there were exclusions or confidential information. But that is only information that is agreed to in the RFP. They can't come to you afterwards and say, we don't want you to publish and let's publish this if it wasn't stated. And I know in military contracts that's a big element of what is allowed to be published and not. But the reason you put this book out there is because it's going to be made available to the public, and so you want to make sure that everyone who worked on the selection and the award did it correctly. Because if there's any suspicion about the process, what's going to happen? Those newspaper folks that we hear this morning, they're going to write about it. There's going to be all sorts of accusations, all sorts of things, and the whole project could be put in jeopardy, and you don't want that situation. So make sure you publish everything, especially if there's going to be a legal challenge to the award. The performance guarantee within 2 weeks. The winning bidder shall furnish a performance guarantee fulfilling the obligations that states here. It should be cashable with recourse to the sponsor in the form of an irrevocable bank guarantee to the minimum, and here's a hard figure of 5% of the project cost or whatever you decided in the RFP. So it doesn't have to be 5% if you've stated that differently in the RFP. It says if the guarantee is not furnished within 6 weeks, so you're telling the company that won, if they can't provide you with that guarantee within 6 weeks, you could disqualify the bidder. So can you see that when you're going through that award process, it's not absolutely certain that the winner wins. Okay, there might be a technical evaluation point that suddenly comes up. There might be 2 companies that are likewise, they've got the same score, that you've got to go through the process. They might disqualify, they might not meet the requirements of how many days, the 7 days that they have to agree to the contract. And so this is part of the process that you've got to go through. But I always say it's never done until the project is actually started, okay? You could have delays, you could have technical things, you could have legal questions, etc., that hold the process up. Now this is the section here for the unsolicited proposals. Remember the difference? The unsolicited proposals when the private sector comes to you with an idea versus you doing the origination. So remember in the very first part of the document early on today, we looked at the whole process of how you do the come up with the option paper, the pre-feasibility and all that. This is different now with the unsolicited proposal because you're not doing all that groundwork. You're getting the private sector that has to do a certain amount of groundwork and come to you with the document. This is one of the things that you have to insist on, that they do a good feasibility study according to the standards that you would have expected of your ministry. Okay? Because you don't want a bad document. Because how can you evaluate if it's even a worthwhile project to even consider moving forward? So here the line ministry may accept unsolicited proposals. This is important. The project shall not require any form of government financial support. So that they can't say to you, you've got to give us special deals or etc. to make this project because it's their project. If it's on terms that you don't want to accept, you don't have to accept the unsolicited proposal. The project also, and this is important, must not have been or shall not have been identified by the line ministry as a project you want to do. Because then it's really not, if you've got it in your list already, the private sector needs to be patient and wait until you go and procure it. They can't try and bypass the process. So those are 2 conditions. No government financing. The other is it can't be identified before. And then this is the most important statement, and please underline that, okay, under C. Unsolicited proposals shall not be for monopolistic services. So if this is airports, and ports and things like that, okay? You can't have people coming to you with an unsolicited proposal, okay? This will have to be decided by the ministers, but that's what it's proposing, okay? And I think the reason for that is because you had problems with like Hambantota, you had problems with, the Rajapaksa International Airport and that, and there's now concern is do we have the ability to evaluate a project that is going to be monopolistic, and what they mean, it's going to form a monopoly in one area because there's no competition from any other facilities in that area. Okay, so there's a procedure that is also recommended for accepting these unsolicited proposals. Any private entity may submit an unsolicited proposal to the line ministry, which must include, and then there's all these, the details, the technical, etc. Essentially what you're stating here is what would have gone into that position paper or that option paper, that feasibility study. Now, one thing that's going to be interesting to see how it evolves, and I'm not sure where that's going, is basically here we're stating that these proposals should go to the line ministry. The question is what happens if a company, for example, goes to the NAPPP and says, we've got an unsolicited proposal. Does that mean that the NAPPP then submits it to you guys to make the decision? You will have to think that through. Okay. The other things that's important here, the line ministry will be responsible for the review. The line ministry can get advice from the NAPPP to work through the process. And then if it's not approved, the unsolicited proposal does not proceed. If it's a bad project, it's not worthwhile considering, it is not financially viable, etc. Okay? Don't try and correct it and correct it and correct it so it becomes acceptable. If it's a bad project, it's a bad project. You don't want to keep on submitting it back to the private sector and saying, rewrite it, because what are you doing? You're coaching them then how to write a good project. Okay. I don't know if the person's here, but in one of the previous workshops, one of the people made a very good statement to me, and I've never forgotten it. It said, PPPs should not be about privatization of profit and nationalization of debt. Okay, do you get that? It's really true. So I'll repeat it. PPPs are not about privatization of profit and nationalization of debt. Okay, and what was that person saying? It's got to be a good deal for both parties. And that doesn't mean that it's all about the private sector making profit, and if the project goes wrong, that the government sits with the debt. Okay. And when I get back, I'm going to make a sign of that, and I'm going to put it above my door, because I think it's one of the most, how would you call it, insightful comments that I've ever heard from somebody. So maybe that's something you should write and stick above the door in your office as well when you make those considerations about PPPs. Okay, so you'll go through the process, and it says here there's a process for identifying it. That's that table that we've got, or that graphic up front, where it's in the front of the document. And then you will send it to the cabinet papers prepared. It goes to line ministry, submitted. This is all similar to what you would do in the normal process. I'm not going to read it, but it says, if approved, it demonstrates that the project offers value for money and shall continue to the procurement phase. So this is the important thing where the private sector often gets surprised, that they think when they issue an unsolicited proposal that the government is just going to select it and just give it to them. That's not the way it works. Okay. What you will do then is you will use their proposal to start a procurement process. Expression of interests, request for proposals, etc. But you will use the information that they provided you to form the basis of the procurement. Because why are you doing that? The only way you can determine value for money is by making a comparison. Okay. And I think that's been part of the problem in Sri Lanka in the past, that a lot of private companies made these unsolicited proposals to the government, and they were accepted, and it wasn't necessarily checked, compared with, there was no competition, and so the country didn't necessarily actually get a good deal. I always say that it's like a salesman. If somebody comes to you and the deal seems too good, then there's something wrong. You know, if you feel this is this is the best thing, give it the 24-hour rule and think about it again, and then go back and start thinking about it. So you'll go through the process again. This is, you can see that in sections 40 and 41, but this is the whole process of basically going through pre-qualification, checking, comparing the different bids against one another. So it's not just a process where they are accepted. The Swiss challenge is introduced here, okay? And the Swiss challenge is where the company that provided the unsolicited proposal has to compete against other companies, but they are given a little bit of an advantage, like a credit in scoring, or they are given a concession in the financials or something, because they came up with the idea. Okay. But if there's one thing to just remember with the unsolicited proposals and the Swiss process, is that the biggest challenge is managing the intellectual property, you know, that proprietary information, especially in weapons systems and things like that. Or anyone from, there was a guy from the Postal Service, so when it comes to telecommunications and things like that, there's often proprietary information that is involved. So once the bids are received and evaluated, you request the original bidder to match. This is what you do. We said here, you match so that the company that made the unsolicited proposal will get to match the winning proposal. So sometimes they might have the best proposal and they win. Other times, another company might win. But this is where you give them the chance that they're not automatically disqualified. You're saying, okay, you had a good idea, you had a good proposal, it passed the test, we've solicited, but another company, unfortunately, has come up with something slightly better than you, so they are the winning bidder, you are not. Okay, but we're going to give you a chance to meet, or to match, if you want to call it, the winning bid. And then that gives the original company the chance, and if they can't meet it, then the winning bid moves forward. If they do meet it, then the winning bid becomes the losing bid. And this is the language that is stated here. Then once the PPP contract is signed, the Ministry of Finance, and this is a controversial one, and this has to be very, very well defined. The Ministry of Finance shall reimburse the original bidder with the cost assumed by the original bidder to develop the pre-feasibility study as approved by the line ministry. So you will give compensation to the unsolicited bid company to cover their costs if they're not selected. But a warning, you may need to make sure that they come to you with a reasonable cost. Okay. If it costs them, and I'm just making this up, $100,000 to do the feasibility study, they shouldn't be coming to you for $200,000. You need to check what their feasibility study cost them before you reimburse them. Okay, so we're getting close to the end here. This is the contract management performance monitoring of the construction and operations.
Based on its urgency and the need. Some areas it is not unattractive to the investors.
Yeah.
So can we give some guidelines to here also?
Yeah, make some recommendations. Yeah. We want to hear from you. So if you've got some ideas, that's good. Okay. You had a question? Yes.
In the Swiss challenge, there is a issue with the intellectual property.
Yes.
How do you tackle that matter with this guideline?
Okay. So this is a guideline. Okay. What you would have to do is in your RFP, your request for proposals. Okay. You're going to, well, let's put it this way, first of all. When the company comes to you with the unsolicited bid and it offers you a thing, you need to negotiate with them first of all, okay, what information that they've given to you, you want to publish, okay, because you've got to publish this for the RFP if you're going to bring in other companies, okay. The challenge there is how much of that information are you going to publish before they lose their competitive advantage. Do you understand that? Okay. There's no fast rule on how you do that other than the agreement that you reach with the company. And if you push the company too much and the company says, well, I'm not willing to do it, then you can't reach agreement and you're not going to have an unsolicited proposal leading to a Swiss challenge, okay? If they agree to a certain point, okay, you need to state very clearly what information can be made publicly, which shan't, okay? And the information that's made publicly then becomes part of the RFP. But that is the part of the really tough negotiations. And it gets really difficult when it's like weapons systems or when it's IT technology or software and that, because companies not going to want all that information published because it's the way they make their money. It's their competitive edge. So the only challenge I can say to you is you need to, before you say yes or no that you're even going to accept this, you have to reach an agreement with them on what is acceptable on intellectual property that's going to be published. Okay. The thing that you must never do is if they give you information and you turn down the project, okay, and you say we don't want to work with you, 6 months later, don't take that information and use it to create a public solicitation because you will get sued, okay, for intellectual property rights. If it becomes a country develops a reputation that if you hand over intellectual property to the government that it's not safe and secure, you will never get companies who have got really good proprietary information even bothering to bid because they're scared that the information is going to be stolen. Okay.
I think sometimes the concept itself is an innovation.
Yeah.
So the concept, if you give the publicity on that, then again it will be I think something how do I say concept itself may be an intellectual property.
And that's the risk the private company's got to take. And this is if they've come up with something that's really innovative, okay, they will have an advantage over the other companies if that information is made available, because the other companies are going to have to think through what that innovation is. And you would give them an advantage, a 10% score or an extra score for doing the thought process. But it gets very, very complicated, and you can't, with an unsolicited proposal, you can't, there's a certain amount of information you have to put in, otherwise it's an unfair bid, okay? And that's the difficult, and this is, to be absolutely honest, why I'm not very excited about unsolicited proposals, because there are so many challenges and extra steps and controversies around it that, you know, sometimes it's difficult. I was in Louisiana 2 weeks ago at a conference, and the head of the state of Louisiana was talking about unsolicited proposals. And he said the two biggest challenges they face with unsolicited proposals is when it's proposed in the wrong time of the budget cycle, because, you know, somebody comes and says, I've got a great project for you, but they haven't got the budget to do the feasibility study, to do the evaluation, to do the procurement. And the other biggest challenge, he said, is crazy expectations on information that is given to the government, and then it's got to be decided with freedom of information. You know, you have public freedom of information. How much of that information can be given? Because you could, the company could give you information, okay, and you could be in the situation, you say, okay, we're going to guarantee the information, but if you don't know your freedom of information laws or however it's stated, you might be forced if another company comes along and says, you know, we want access to this information. And then where does that get you? So it's difficult. So I'm not going to say don't do unsolicited proposals. I'm just saying that there's a whole level of complication on top of that. And in the question, the biggest question with unsolicited proposals is determining, do you even want it? Is it a project that you really want, really need? Is it going to add value? Is it public value? Is it going to add value for money? Or is the company going to benefit from it? Okay. So we've got the situation then that it goes through the normal process of being signed, the award is made, then we get to the contract management and performance. Okay. One of the things that is important, you do need to have a contract manager to manage the project throughout its lifetime. That is, I think, quite obvious. Otherwise, you have the weird situation I told you about Central America with the power station. No one was managing the contract, and no one even knew that it was finished. You need to have the responsibilities of the contract manager clearly defined as well. So this is one of the reasons that you need to be very clear about when you launch PPPs, that are you going to have the resources in your ministry to manage the project? Okay, and I'll just throw an extra thing in, okay? If the contract is 20 or 30 years old, I mean in length, who's going to manage it? Okay, if they ask me, I'm going to be dead before that contract is finished, okay? Unless I'm, well, I won't even say how old I am, but that's going to be, you know. Or are you going to put a contract manager who's a very young person to manage the contract for 30 years? But that person might not be experienced enough. Okay, you know, it would have to be a 20-something person to manage a 30-year contract. And the challenges that you have to think is, are you going to hire someone who wants to, for their whole career, just work on one project? Okay, maybe somebody wants to do that. I don't know. But I would have been very upset when I was younger if somebody said, David, congratulations. You've been awarded, you're going to be the project manager, and you're going to be doing the same job for the next 30 years with no promotion, no salary increase, nothing like that. You know what I would have said? Goodbye, I resign. Okay, so the contract manager is really important, and there's one thing that I'm going to add this advice: when you choose a contract manager, you've got to have succession planning in place. Okay, that what happens if that contract manager retires, goes to another job, drops dead, okay? It can happen, okay? You've got to think about that when you select the contract manager. And the challenge for most is you need such a highly qualified contract manager when you select it that it's usually going to be a person who you know is not going to be around for the duration of the contract. So there's the responsibilities. These are typical. I don't think these are ones that you would find very strange, but here they talk about they've got to make sure the project follows the timelines, obligations specified in the contract. Performance standards are very important, the delivery standards, the performance, the financial performance standards, adherence to the reporting procedures. And this is important, that you need to define, when you use these guidelines, how many reports are going to be provided to your contract manager. Is it a monthly report? Are you going to ask for quarterly reports? I would never ask for yearly reports. So much can happen in a year that's a disaster. But you need to have very clear statements on the measurement and the testing and in reports on the performance of the company as well. There's also the one that the private sector doesn't like, and that's E, if there are penalties that are going to be involved. So if they don't perform, do they get less profit? Do they get fined? Do they have to, these are all the type of questions you need to state. If there's something going wrong, remedial, what I mean by remedial, those are corrective strategies that you have to define. Disputes you need to talk about, etc. Now, there's a suggestion under 73 that you also consider employing an independent consultant, an independent engineer. This is usually valid for a ministry who's only going to do one project and never intends to build up the expertise to manage this project. You'd rather get a person who's worked all over the world on 20 of these types of projects to be the independent engineer. Or, over time, you might have an independent engineer and that person mentors somebody within your organization, so it's a learning process, so that eventually you build the capacity within your institution. But it is important that if you don't have the ability and you don't have somebody, and it says here, that the person doesn't exist within your ministry, that you need to consider an independent engineer. Okay. There's also the responsibilities. I think this is pretty straightforward. Reviewing and inspecting the operation and maintenance. This is for those 20 to 25 years of the project. Reviewing and inspecting the capacity of the private partner, etc. So there is a lot of reasons, good reasons for having an independent engineer if you are only going to do a once-off project, or maybe even two of them. And it depends on the ministry. But if it's a road authority and you're doing 10 toll roads, you're not always going to use independent engineers. Is that straightforward? I think that's a pretty straightforward comment. And then here, for example, the recommendation is that you prepare and submit to the contract manager a monthly progress report. Then there's the lead financial institution. This is important here. The ministry shall require the private partner to identify the lead financial institution providing financing to the private party. So this is the company, also the bank, that is paid the most or is carrying most of the debt. And they will basically want to have information, and you'll get this information from the lead financial institution. It says there on the statement of debt and equity contributions, defaults, potentials of defaults, so challenges that are arising, and any other relevant information. And then the reports will be such, you'll have these independent financial reports as recommended that they submitted every 6 months, and they also then basically 6 months or annually until the operation period is finished. The last piece, and I'm sure you're relieved that we've got to the last here, is the contract management plan. This is the plan that you're going to put in place for the management of the contract for the 20 or 30 years. We didn't go into a lot of detail other than just stating the things that you should put in a contract management plan. And the information in the contract management plan often comes from those terms of reference that you have in your contract when you set up the studies and you stated what you wanted. So it's very simply there. You can just read it, managing the developments, resolving disputes, contracts and its schedule, financial agreements, roles and the names, roles and contact details of individuals, etc. The risk management plan is important. The performance management plan is part of it. So you will have a series of documents. And the final comment I'm going to make there, what is important, that contract manager can't be a person who's operating on his or her own. Needs a support team. Okay, just think of an enormous multi-million-dollar contract. How much paperwork, how many reports and that can be generated. I mean, that person would go insane or crazy, I think, if they did it on their own. So contract management plan is the most important. So we have got through a lot of information. I'm sorry it wasn't more exciting. I tried to get smiles. I got smiles from people. I tried to tell a joke here and there. But it is really important that when you leave here today, if you've made comments, that we get them. That will help us. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much. If somebody says to you that you have to do a PPP within 6 months, I think you're going to be in a bit of a world of hurt. Okay. Try and set a timeline of up to 2 years, depending. Now, I'm talking about very large infrastructure projects. If it's a service project, it could be different. Okay. Then the process of the whole procurement, once you're doing the expression of interests, the RFPs and all of that, that can easily add another 6 months to the process, if you think of it. Okay. So you're looking now at, 2.5 years, if we're being very optimistic. Okay. Then there's that whole part, we talked about the contract negotiations, the feasibility, that if you add up all those weeks that we were talking about, we were talking at least, maybe another 2 to 3 months. Okay. So you could, from the concept idea to the actual signing and the launch of the project, you could be looking at about 2.5 years. Would you agree with me, Tommy, if you're being realistic?
There's no fast track.
Okay. So when people start talking about fast tracking, you hopefully, when they talk about fast tracking, what they're talking about is not trying to speed up the process, but providing you with the resources that you can do the process more effectively. Okay. But I don't know. I've seen it. Countries that have tried to prepare PPPs in under a year, it's been a disaster. Well, I think we've reached the end. I've learned another term today. Bahoma Estuti. Thank you very much. Subagaman. So we see you again.